I think that's our 1 minute timer. When the recording starts, we've got fair warning. All right, I believe I see all of council present. I think Councilmember Inkin's joining us by phone again this afternoon. But with that, and seeing as though it's 4 o'clock, I'd like to call to order the regular meeting of the Frisco Town Council. Can I have the roll call, please?
Mortensen.
Here.
Aronson.
Here.
Burley.
Here.
Allen.
Here.
Eld.
Here.
Inkin.
Here.
Thank you. Sherburne.
Here.
Thanks.
Next afternoon is public comment. Anyone wishing to do so can do so now. Please unmute yourself, raise your hand, turn on your camera. I will call on you. Please state your name and your address for the record. Be topic specific for anything not on this evening's agenda, and limit your comments to no longer than 3 minutes. Is there anyone wishing to make public comment this afternoon? I'm seeing no public comment at this time, so I'll close public comment and turn over for mayor and council comments. Or excuse me, sorry, switched up a little bit. New agenda format. We're trying new things. Is adding in the approval of the agenda for this evening. Do I have a motion to approve the agenda as is published?
Mr. Mayor, I move the approval of the agenda.
It's been moved by Mayor Pro Tem Burley. Is there a second to approve the agenda?
Second.
Seconded by Councilmember Fallon. Any conversation? Can you call the question, please?
Certainly. Mortensen.
Yes.
Aronson.
Yes.
Burley.
Yes.
Allen.
Yes.
Eld.
Yes.
Inkin.
Yes.
Sherburne.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now I'll turn it over for council mayor comments. Change is hard sometimes. Jesse, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just wanted to take a moment to express my support for your proposal on the declaration of housing emergency, Mr. Mayor. I think it's innovative. I think it's timely, and I think that it sets a sense of urgency that we haven't quite reached a level of yet. And I hope that it can help free up some staff time, some opportunities, and some funding that we haven't been privy to at this point. So I hope that this council will, take it up and have that discussion. And I think that the conversation in the public and the media that has been already happening around this subject is very well received and a positive change for Frisco. So I just wanted to express that. And then also thank you to the Make Frisco team, the arts committee, because while it is on consent agenda tonight, I just think that the mural proposal is so amazing and is really what we need right now for Frisco, kind of emerging out of the darkness, coming into summer, excuse me, not summit. I just think you guys did a really good job. So thank you for that as well. And we look forward to seeing that on Main Street. So thanks.
Thank you, Jesse. Appreciate that. Appreciate your support. Other council comments?
I'll just say thank you, Jesse, for mentioning that. And it was really, really fun to review. We got, in addition to the 2 that we received before, I believe 7 or so. So we had 9 or 10 proposals. They were all outstanding. And I'm so excited about the team that we selected. And it was a very democratic process with lots of great discussion. And Andy was a big part of leading us through, to select the right one. So thanks, Jesse, for bringing that up, and look forward to seeing how it all comes together. Yay.
Thank you, Melissa. And thanks for asking us for a couple more weeks to get more bids. I think that was obviously proved to be the right approach. So appreciate that. Others? I'd say a couple things on my list is just thanks everyone who came out for town cleanup. It sounds like and looks like it was another overwhelming success. I think it's one of the coolest things we do as a town and as a community, and it's a great way to get out and show our pride in where we live and do good. And it's always great when you see other folks cruising around picking up trash with their orange bags. So I always appreciate that day. And now that it's a 2-week process, I think that's even better. And hopefully next year, maybe we'll be barbecuing again. We'll see. But thanks for everybody who did that. And Andrew, go ahead. I see you.
No, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I'm sorry. I thought.
Okay.
But to add on, thank you. We had the bus barn. Thank you to the volunteers the other day. And it was fabulous, not just the energy of acknowledging and watching Amy Wineland ride in on the top of a vehicle as just building the energy and the thank yous, and especially the opportunity, which is the first time since I've been on council, to actually just sort of hang out with other councils and other staff. And it was just an opportunity that reaps benefits, because it's going to cost me coffee and calories because I'm already setting up times to meet with people who I look forward to meeting with. So it's good stuff. It was a great purpose and a great result.
Thanks for pushing that to begin with, Andy. I appreciate that. And on that note, for those who haven't seen lots coming out of the governor's office, but the Colorado comeback for all of those who are vaccinated or entered into win $1 million. So there's still time to get vaccinated. We don't have the percentages we really want, so encourage those who haven't had a chance yet to do it. It's not over yet, and now there's even better incentives. So and also lots of to Jesse's earlier comment, potentially lots of good funding potentially available in the coming weeks and months towards housing and other community projects coming out of the governor's office in the state that I hope we can work together to leverage. So other comments? All right, seeing none, move on to staff updates. Jeff, any updates this afternoon that weren't in the packet?
I don't think we have any additional updates, Mayor.
Great, thank you very much. Appreciate that. Then on to, excuse me, the work session, agenda item number 1. And I think the timeliness of the historic and sad 1-year anniversary of the day is probably really appropriate to where we are and what we're doing. And so looking forward to the continuation of our social equity training. And I see Lily's probably adjusting the lights in her office, but Loli is here, and I'll turn it over to Jeff. Loli, who's kicking this one off?
Yeah, I'll toss it right over to Loli. Thanks,
Great.
Loli.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Council, for being here and for all your time last Council meeting and engagement. Very important topic, as we know, so we appreciate it. With that, I'm going to pass it on to Chante and Rita and the NLC team to continue with this wonderful topic and very informative and timing, like you just said, Mr. Mayor. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you very much, Loli, and to all the council for yet again giving us some more of your time and being willing to stick with us for another opportunity to dive deeper into racial equity and all of those things that come with it. So we want to first just really say thank you guys again. The last session that we had, we truly appreciated the way that you all leaned in, the way that you all provided conversation, and the way that you were processing. And so hopefully you have the opportunity to take some time to take a step back and just think about some of the things that were discussed and some of the things that were learned and how you can bring that into this space that we're having today. And in addition to that, before we jump right into reminding you all just about some of the learning environment that we have here, we wanted to start off, with an amazing quote from the amazing Mr. James A. Baldwin. And it's a great way to just kind of move us through the day. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. And as your amazing mayor just talked about, that we are at that 1-year anniversary as it relates to George Floyd, I think that this quote is definitely appropriate for the time that we're in. And again, this is an opportunity for you all in your city to start to think about the things that you are proud of and those things that you want to lean into in an effort to be able to continue to work through and to change. And you being here tonight is an acknowledgement of your commitment and of your desire to do just what Mr. Baldwin said, to lean into those things and to start to work to see what change looks like for the town of Fresco. Tonight, you will have 2 beautiful voices that you'll hear often instead of 3. Unfortunately, not unfortunately, Daryl could not be with us because he is off getting married and on his honeymoon. And so he has left Rita and I and Melissa to fend for ourselves. So Rita and I will be the lead trainers for today. And Melissa, who's fabulous on our team, will be running the behind the scenes. But just wanted to let you guys know about that change so that you won't be wondering where the heck is Daryl. He did not abandon you all. He wished that he could be here, but I believe his wife wanted him with her a little bit more. So with that being said, we'll take a quick pause and move on to the next slide so we can just give a quick reminder about the learning environment. So some of the things that we talked about during your first session, we just wanted to again remind you guys today of the type of learning environment that we're working to set as you start to learn different concepts and engage with each other and have continuous dialogue. So the space that we're in, it is a brave space. The fact that you all are sitting here in your chairs today, looking at the camera, being present is an acknowledgement of the fact that that you're brave to take on this topic and you're brave to also share your thoughts and your opinions when it's appropriate. In addition to that, what is said here stays here. In addition to that, again, this is just a quick reminder from last time. What is learned here, we really want you to take that with you. We don't want that to stay in this space. So have the conversations with your family members, additional colleagues. Start to think about the town of Fresco and what are those things that from what you've learned that you can apply. We don't want you to leave it in the seat that you're sitting in today. In addition to that, offer what you can and ask for what you need. If you have thoughts and you have opinions that you feel like you want to share, we welcome that into this space. However, if you need a little help trying to understand how you're feeling, trying to understand some of the things that you're processing, we're asking that you ask. Be brave and to ask those questions here. We are in a time of learning, and so that is very much welcome. Lean into the uncomfortable. I think you guys can remember from the video that we watched, the house that we live in. We talked about a lot of things that were tough to see, tough to watch, tough to hear. And all of you leaned into that uncomfort. You didn't shy away. And that again is another acknowledgement that this is a brave space that you all helped to create. And we're asking that you do that again tonight. In addition, start where you are. Please, 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 please do not come into this room, this virtual room, thinking that you have to have it all figured out, thinking that you have to be a racial equity expert, thinking that if you do not have all the answers, then you have failed. That is not where we are. What we want you to do is the very place that you are in your understanding of, or the ways that you don't understand racial equity. We want you to know that that is okay, and that is not something that you have to run from or hide from. And then participation is a learning opportunity. The more you lean in, the more that you contribute, the more that you offer up your thoughts and your insights and your questions, the more that you're going to be able to learn, and your colleagues will be able to learn right along with you. And then lastly, we're asking you to keep your cameras on if possible. So we recognize the fact that this is a virtual space. Like I said before, you may have kids, family members running around. Who knows, a soccer ball could come out of nowhere and you feel like you need to yell at a kid. We're okay with that and fully understand the fact that you might need to turn your camera off because you don't want us to see that. However, if you are not experiencing those types of things, we're asking that, for the time that you're with us, that you will leave your camera on as it's possible. So we just wanted to take a little bit of time to really go over that learning environment again. And I'll pause for just a second before I kick it over to Rita to see if there are any questions or thoughts as it relates to the learning environment. All right, Rita, to you it goes.
Thank you, Shantae, for that important reminder, and welcome to all. It's a pleasure to be with you again, as Shantae said, as we go on the next step of this journey. We won't finish tonight. This is something that you will continue, and we hope to help you continue. But if you recall, the 2 parts of the documentary that we watched on May 11th, As Shantae said, there were elements in there that none of us learned in school. So it was new news for many, and sometimes hard news to absorb, information that we sort of need to let it soak in and understand that there is a long legacy, a long historical context that we may not have been a part of. But if we think back to the quote of James Baldwin, until we address the fact that we know change is needed, we can't face into that change. So this is a map of one of over 240 cities that were redlined in the late 30s and early 40s. Again, if you recall from the house we live in, this happened all over the country, and it had has had long-standing repercussions for those cities. So this is Denver. It's the closest city I could find to Frisco. This is the redlining map that shows you those areas that were designated red or dangerous, or yellow, blue, and green, successively better parts of the city, places where investment then happened. And the red areas is where disinvestment has had a long story. We, NLC Real, has had a long relationship with the city of Denver, actually for the past 3 years, working with them and their department heads and their organization to really move forward and develop a racial equity plan for the city, department by department. And I had the chance to work closely with the Office of Children's Affairs, which provided me an overlay map of zip codes and demographics from the past 7 years. And if you overlay that map to this one, you will see that the divisions created by redlining still exist today. Those same areas, zip code areas, are where your BIPOC communities are living today. Your Latino, your Hispanic, your Black residents are in the areas that did not receive the kind of investments that the other areas did. So this may have happened in the 30s and 40s, but it becomes a challenge to municipal leadership, to offices of planning, to offices of housing, to all of the work you do today, to reflect back and understand the root cause. And once you understand that root cause and see that historical context, you can begin to comprehend why divisions exist along specific areas on a map. So that legacy is with us, and that's what the kind of change that we're looking to address through leadership, through policy, through sustained change. Next slide. Again, just to recap, as we told you on the 11th, we're spending a lot of time in the first of the 3 prongs of the national practice to normalize, to get that shared understanding, shared definitions, common ground around the history, the context of racial inequality, and then acknowledge together the urgency to set priorities and to bring around change. But we also want to guide you through, and we will by the end of this evening, through the other 2 prongs of this 3-step national practice. We want to help you organize around the context that you learn, that shared understanding, and really start looking at the internal infrastructure, the way the city is organized, the way your departments are addressing specific issues, the way you engage with your community in partnership to bring about change and to help address issues of concern. And once you've gone through the normalizing and the organizing, then you can move to action. All of the cities we work with want to start at 3. They want to operationalize. They want to say, tell me what to do, how to do it, when to do it, and when will we be done? But before you get to that action plan, you really need to go through the first 2 steps. So we're going to continue that journey in the normalizing space tonight, but we are going to give you a preview of the other 2 parts of this national practice. Next slide. So we're going to dive right in. What is normalizing? And how can we start to really name that shared terminology, get that common language between us, and move on the urgency that brought us all into this space tonight and into the direction that Frisco wants to go. So this next slide is going to give you an image side by side with yet another image of equality and equity. And on the left-hand side, if you take a close look, you see 3 young people, perhaps, and they've all been given the same box that should help them watch the game over the fence. It's equal. Each one of them received the same thing. But if you look at the individual, it's not serving the need. Whereas on the right-hand side, you see that the taller person doesn't really need the box. The one in the middle can see just fine with 2 boxes. And the one on the right needs a ramp. There's a distinction and an awareness that's been acknowledged on the equity side. Equity equals fairness and justice, whereas equality gives everyone the same thing, but may not be addressing the need from where they stand or sit. So we came across these images early in our curriculum development, but they didn't really quite hit the mark. So we came up with the next slide, which goes to the nuance a little bit more deeply. So if we move, we can see here, we've got 3 individuals, all the same size. But what's different? The ground below them is not level. The fence in front of them is of different heights. So on the left, when we give them the same thing, when everything is equal, we give them each 1 box, it's not helping each of them in an equitable fashion. Whereas on the right, we compensate for the unlevel playing field on the outside of the fence and the differing heights of the fence. But then you go deeper and you say, but wait, is the goal to watch the game from outside the fence? If that's the case, what we have provided on the right-hand side does achieve equity and justice for watching the game from outside the fence. But what's the next question? Why aren't they in the seats in the stadium? Why aren't they in the skyboxes? Why aren't they on the field in the game? Why don't they own the team? What are the barriers that are creating this yet deeper, more nuanced situation that if you look more closely, you start to ask yourself the questions about equity versus equality. Again, equality equals the same for everyone, but it doesn't address where people come from, what their experience is, what the playing field below, what the level of the ground is below them, or the barriers, historic or otherwise, that may be in front of them. So it is looking at it from a different perspective and really thinking, how do I achieve justice? How do I achieve fairness? How do I get to equity? So this image helps us illustrate that a little bit more deeply. Next slide. So here we have to step into the space of bias and what bias actually means. Bias is both implicit and explicit, and it's something that we all have. It's something that comes up through our experiences, through our upbringing, through our relationships, through our families, through our work experiences. The explicit bias that we all carry is that more visible expression of bias in a given situation. And in most cases today, that explicit bias is actually no longer acceptable. It's obvious, it's in your face. It's that sign in the window of an apartment building that says Mexicans need not apply. And most of that through ordinance, through law, through civil rights actions since the 60s is illegal. So we can understand that it exists, but we can fight it because it's obvious. It's the implicit bias that we carry inside that's expressed indirectly that we're not always aware of. It's in our subconscious that happens and we don't even realize that we're acting out on it. The example that's given here is a property manager does criminal background checks on Black applicants for his or her apartments, but not for white applicants. Again, that's an implicit bias, may not be making an obvious or overt choice that anyone else is aware of, but implicitly they're expressing a bias. And acting on bias in that way can be discriminatory, and it really creates an outcome that is not equitable, negative for particular groups. So it's that implicit bias that we want to begin to try to address. And on the next slide, you kind of begin to get the feeling or an understanding of why this happens. It happens in our unconscious. And our brains, Melissa, can you advance or are we stuck? There we go. Our brains, believe it or not, are processing 5 million bits of information per second, but we're only really aware of a small percentage of that. And we need schemas or frames, and this is getting into the neuroscience, and I'm not a neuroscientist, but that's the only way we can sort through the volume of information that is coming at us in any given second or 1 minute time span. So our brains allow us to sort through all of those things, and we have to make really rapid decisions and put things into categories in order to function in society. So we sort things into categories, we create associations between things, we have tricks for remembering people's names. We make associations to fill in the gaps of the speed with which our brain is moving. For example, our colleague Leon always likes to give the example of the first time he was in New Orleans, he tried alligator for the first time and he tasted it and he said, well, this tastes just like chicken. So he put it into his chicken category. So again, our brain is operating on a subconscious level, putting things into categories based on our experience and based on our familiarity. But sometimes those spontaneous and subconscious actions aren't taking into account the situation that is in front of you. So we're going to test this. We're going to show you a short video on the next slide. And the instruction here is to watch closely and count the number of passes that the team in white makes. And a caveat here, if you've seen this video, don't let on, but go ahead and see if you can count, keep up the count. How many passes does the team dressed in white make? You can hit play, Melissa. Oops, unfortunately, we don't have sound. Can you optimize for sound?
Hold on, sorry everyone, give me one moment.
No worries. I've been right there with you. So we'll get back to the share and reshare.
And then Melissa, if you could start it over, thank you.
Perfect.
There you go.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make?
Go!
All right, if you can unmute yourselves and shout out what the number that you saw.
13.
13.
13.
All right, we've got some good counters on this team. So all right, 13. Let's see what the video narrator tells us.
The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
All right, be honest. How many saw the bear on the first round? Raise your hand. Did anybody see it?
No.
So what happens? What happened is you were told to count the number of passes that the team in white made. So you were focused. You were laser focused on making sure you got that number right. And by golly, you got it right. But for focusing, perhaps you had blinders and you missed something quite obvious that was also happening at the same time. This happens to all of us. It happens to all of us on a daily basis. And I'm going to share a personal story, which on the one hand embarrasses me, but on the other hand was a learning moment for me. When I was in my late 20s, early 30s, I was very active in voter registration in the Latino community here in Washington. I would set up my table in front of the Safeway in Adams Morgan, which was the enclave of the Latino community here in DC. And it was back in the days when you actually filled out a paper form to submit to the registrar to register to vote. So I was doing this one Saturday morning, and a young man came up to me and looked me straight in the eye, and he said, "I've been watching you for the past 15 minutes, and you haven't stopped a single Black person and asked them to register to vote." And I was dumbfounded. I looked at him, and I could have said, no, that's not true. I had to say, if that's what you saw, it must be true. And I said, that's certainly not my intent. I'm focused on Latino voter registration, but that doesn't mean I don't want everyone to register to vote. So I thanked him for pointing this out to me, for taking the time to stand in front of me, in front of Safeway on Columbia Road, and point this out to me. I was exercising, acting out a bias, known or unknown, that was creating an inequitable outcome. So you can be sure that from that point forward, there wasn't a single person who went by my table who I didn't stop and ask to register to vote. But I was so appreciative that someone held up a mirror. That was my unconscious act that needed to be corrected in the moment. So again, we all do this. We may not be aware of it. We need to acknowledge when it's called out to us and move past whatever barrier, whatever bias is precluding us from treating everyone equitably. So here's another test that's maybe a little bit more fun. We're going to show you some slides with colors on them, and as the colors come up, we want you to shout out the color that you see. So once again, another opportunity to come off mute and tell us what color you see first. What color are the lines of text? First line.
Just a second, Rita. If everyone could unmute themselves, because we want you to just shout it out.
Yes, simultaneously. Thank you, Shantae. Great. Okay, Melissa.
Red.
Red.
Black.
Blue.
Green.
Very good. All right, everyone saw the colors? Next slide.
Black.
Red.
Blue.
Green.
All right. Okay. One more test. Go forward, Melissa.
Red.
Blue.
Black. Green.
Well, you all get 4 stars. That's never happened before. 99 times out of 100, people say green, black, red, blue. Because your brain is processing too quickly. You see the words, but you don't see the color, or you see the color, but you mix it up with the word. And this is what happens in our brains. You process as quickly as you can. We usually do it a little faster, so but you all were very focused, and I perhaps I prefaced it a bit much. But anyway, this happens because our brains are sorting, and we're not always conscious of what is right in front of us. We have no trouble seeing the colors, but we have trouble sorting out what we need to say in that moment. So again, another test that lets us know that our brains are working faster than our minds, perhaps, and we need to be aware of what's happening and acknowledge it and make the correction where it's needed. So again, implicit bias doesn't necessarily reflect reality. Because your brain is seeing one thing and your mouth may be saying something else. But what happens is it forces us to make judgments, just like I was unconsciously not stopping everyone and asking them to register to vote. Our implicit biases get expressed in ways that are influenced by society, and it leads us to identify certain groups with certain characteristics, not necessarily based on fact. There's an implicit bias in this country to automatically associate criminal activity, with African Americans, with Black people in our country. And the data does not bear that out. It's an assumption we make, but if we go to the numbers do not affirm that. It's an association we make that has come to us historically by influences in our lives, and we make a rapid assumption. But when we dig deeper and look for the facts, we'll find that we may not be exactly right. So we have another video for you to watch, and we'd like you to sit back, watch it, and try to put yourself in the position of the individual who's experiencing.
Rita, just before we hit play, just want to reiterate some points that you just made. And so, again, we really want you all to know that biases are part of our humanity. It is a part of each and every one of us. And so the key for us to really start to hone into is not to try to ignore our biases, our unconscious biases. Like, that's not what we want to do. We want to move towards acknowledging them. Because once you have the opportunity to acknowledge them, just as Rita talked about, you can start to ask yourself questions as to why. And then you get the opportunity to say, now that I can acknowledge this, you can make a conscious decision of how you want to act. And when you don't acknowledge those biases, you oftentimes inadvertently impact, others, other people's perceptions, where they come from, all those types of things. And so we, again, just want to reiterate, this is not a space to feel like, oh my gosh, I have a bias. That's not it. This is a space to say, oh my goodness, we all have them. It's who we are, it's how we've been wired, just as Rita said. And so as you take this opportunity to look at this video, what we would ask you to do is just, if you have a sheet of paper and pen, just jot down some of the things that you notice and some of the things or ways that this video may have made you think, or feel. Things that you'll see at the end of that video, it says, let's talk about the look so that we can move beyond it. And that's the space that we want to create today. Again, how do we not ignore it? How do we talk about it? So with that being said, what do you see the judge is experiencing in this short video from your perspective?
He's closed out by everyone he passes for one reason or another, whether it's the windows rolling up or he just is kind of at the outside of the community he's in.
It's implicit bias, but yeah, it's everywhere. But how about the idea that this particular person overcame and became a judge? How many people are judges, right? And yes, he might have experienced however many things along the way. Hopefully that's fueled him to achieve more.
Thank you, Andy. Anyone else? And to Andy's point, he definitely has achieved certain things. And I think it's something to be able to overcome obstacles. And we want to be able to acknowledge that. And we want to be able to celebrate that as well. But I think we also want to start to talk about how can we remove some of those obstacles that aren't necessary. Now, in life, my father would easily say and have the same point of view, Andy, that you have, and I have it as well. Keep fighting, keep going, jump through. And that definitely can get you to the other side of things. But I think if we want to think about how do we create better worlds, not just for ourselves, but for the future, how do we eliminate those obstacles that are unnecessary so that folks can possibly achieve more, so that people may have the opportunity to share more. And then we leave those obstacles that are those natural things that people should have to overcome, just working hard in general. But that's one of those things that, and I appreciate your perspective, because we should celebrate the fact that he has overcome. And we should also think about how do we remove some of those obstacles as well for those that have to deal with them, and the caveat of those other folks who may not have to. But I really appreciate you bringing that out because he did. And I'm not sure if that was his son or his nephew or whoever, but he's also a great role model with that too, so those things we gotta celebrate. And again, still figure out what do we do as it relates to those obstacles that shouldn't be there. Anyone else? So what do you think the judge is experiencing?
I thought it was interesting that we feel this, at least I felt this kind of sense of sympathy towards the end, and where you're like, oh, well, he's a judge, you shouldn't treat him that way. But like, why does he have to be a judge for us not to treat him that way? Like, it doesn't matter who he is at the end. Like, the experience that he just had that whole film was completely inappropriate. And he's, and so for me, it's like, it doesn't matter that he was successful in the end. And like, look at this guy we should all have respect for. Like, we should have been doing that the entire time. Thank you, Jesse. Appreciate that. And that's a very powerful perspective that you just gave. Like, why does it matter your title or what you've achieved or how much money you have or your status? Do human beings, no matter where they come from, deserve the same level of respect, kindness, love, and compassion and empathy? Great perspective that I think we all can think about in one way, shape, or form. And just like we just said, we're all impacted by biases, myself included. None of us are exempt from that. But to challenge ourselves with the type of perspective, Jesse, that you just provided, I think is extremely important for all of us to keep going on this path or this journey that we're on together called walking this earth together. Appreciate that. Anyone else? What do you see?
Well, I'll be really honest. When you see a video of, kids waving and the mom, raising the windows, to me, that's like embarrassing. And, I think that when most of us see a video like that, it's kind of like, God, I would never act like that. And so I think it's important to also recognize that, this is it. You can't. This isn't like it's happening to this man, every single person he interacts with, but
Right.
It's that one person out of 20 or one person out of 10. And so it's over a lifetime is what it really can create huge amounts of social inequity. And I point that out because it's like kind of, I think a natural reaction of a white person is like, oh my God, I would never do that. Like, and just to be perfectly honest. And so it paints kind of like a picture of that happening just constantly. But, I fully appreciate that it happens enough that it's something that we need to address as a society. So, that is just one of my gut reactions.
I appreciate you sharing that, Melissa S. I have to call you Melissa S. because Melissa J is running the behind the scenes.
Absolutely.
But a great perspective as well. Like, we're not saying that everybody treats him this way. Mm-hmm. But to your point, enough interactions or he's had enough encounters, that if this is how he's viewed, what does that look like as we're thinking about policy? Last time that we had the chance to connect and get together, we saw the documentary, The House That We Live In. how's policy impacted by biases? And those are things that, we should really dive deeper into as we're also thinking about the individual level of implicit and explicit biases. So truly appreciate that. Anyone else before I ask the next question? So it's hard for us to be able to say specifically or precisely what was running through each person's mind, that he had this interaction with. But I would love to know from your guys' perspective, what stereotypes of Black people, or specifically Black men, may have informed others' actions towards the judge?
I'm sorry, were you talking interactions between the judge and other Black people? Is that what you're talking about?
No, I'll be more specific. My apologies. So the interactions that he had with the people that seemed to judge him in that moment, what do you believe could potentially have been some of those stereotypes that may have run through their minds that caused that interaction that he may have experienced with them?
Personally, I'm, not going to bring up individual stereotypes. I'm one of them. But what I will say is that, the feeling I get when I see those looks there, it disgusts me. That's the way it is. I can tell you that I offer a smile to everybody. That is the bottom line. It doesn't matter where I am. We can't ever judge or understand what anybody has been through or what they're going through or anything, anyone you meet on the street. And so, I've experienced the same thing, again, not because of my skin color, but my heritage, right? And again, that just, I don't know what to say about bias. Bias is there. I feel like it's something that I've battled against my entire conscious life. All I can really hope to do is, offer another human being the same grace as any other. That's about all I can say.
No, Andy, I appreciate the fact that one of the things you said, you always try to offer somebody a smile and want to offer them grace. And I think that is noble and commendable and something that should be spread across on a broader spectrum. But I also think we can talk about the reality of the world that we live in. And although that is how you make the conscious decision and effort to be able to treat folks, I think one of the things that this video displays is that not everybody has that. And because of that, one of the things that is important for us at Real to do is, again, not to run away from biases, not to pretend as if they don't exist, or not even to say, because I don't try to display these types of actions, this is how I feel everybody should. We want to acknowledge the biases that are there because they still impact people's lives. And so I think one of the things that we're trying to get at with this question is for us to acknowledge some of those stereotypes. And it can be a difficult thing to be able to acknowledge because sometimes it's ugly. But the reality is, as it relates to one of the examples that Rita provided you all, her own personal example, to be able to hold the mirror up. And so in this instance, we're trying to hold the mirror up to potentially some of the ways some of those folks in this clip may have thought or felt. So that's one of the reasons why we're asking, not saying that you feel this way, because you made it very clear. And also wanted to say, not saying that any of you who may answer this question feel this way. We're talking specifically about the people, in the video that he had the interactions with.
Fair enough.
So,
go ahead.
Absolutely.
With that, the bottom line is, what is it that you fear, right? What do you fear? And our system has built, different areas for us to fear different things, depending on where you're at.
Absolutely.
We all fear potentially different things, but when we have people in office that are saying we can't let rapists across the border and stuff like that, that's just instilling fear. And so, it's sure we're confronting our fears too, but I'm not afraid of people's skin colors, personally, right? Obviously, in the video, other people are, right? Just like other people have been afraid of me. That's one of those things. So I think it's fear.
I appreciate that. That was a powerful piece. Fear is a powerful emotion, and that could definitely impact how somebody could be treated. So thank you, Andy. And again, I just want to say fear, like the way that you said that could also be grounded in a whole host of other stereotypes as well. Anyone else? What are those stereotypes that you think that you could potentially believe that these people were thinking about as it relates to the judge?
Well, I think that we just, we as in the human race, have a tendency to act different towards people that are different than us, that aren't part of the same socioeconomic groups, that aren't, in this case, the same color. And so I think that has been programmed, on so many different levels. I think it's also, to many of our points is, it's important that we translate this to us as policymakers. And the reason why we're seeing this is to help, as you all pointed out in our last session, to help break down those barriers that may exist in the form of policy in the town of Frisco. And so while we may not have acted with bias, I'm sure each and every one of us have acted with bias at some point in our lives. And so maybe not to this degree, but, it exists. And to what you were saying earlier, Shante, it's natural for humans. So then how do we translate that into policy? And so I look forward to what you all, how you guide us to that point.
Melissa S., I truly appreciate your comments as well. Policy is important. And if we're not holding a mirror up to ourselves to see how we think about bias, it'll be really hard to see biases in policies. And you guys are powerful leaders within the town of Frisco. So being able to dive deeper into that space of understanding not just, explicit and implicit bias as it relates to you as an individual, but this piece is to help to lead us to how do you then start to see implicit and explicit bias in institutions, in structures, and in institutions and structures, that's where policy plays. And so we want to be able to kind of, again, set that stage so that we will be able to think more about what does that look like in just what you said, Melissa, in the policies that we create, in the policies that we uphold, and in the policies that we sometimes turn our head away from. So I appreciate that piece. Anyone else? No worries. Again, truly appreciate you guys leaning in. Truly appreciate you all engaging. And I'm going to kick it over to Rita, who's going to talk a little bit more about acknowledging biases. And then I will jump back in and talk more about some of those examples.
Thanks, Shante. And thanks to all of you who really dove into that a bit and analyzed the fact that assumptions were being made and that the judge was experiencing stressors in a repeated fashion, absorbing them, being resilient, certainly. But what did it represent? Just like my example, totally unaware that I was ignoring a whole swath of people who were walking in front of me. Not intentionally, but overtly, if someone could see it. So this is that mirror that we can all take a breath and say, we know that bias is a part of our humanity, and then we need to begin to examine our own biases. We know we have them. It's part of being human, and it requires an external perspective sometimes to hold that mirror up, because many of our biases are so unconscious. They're so deeply embedded. And then we need to try to actively suppress them because they come up so automatically. And that's the unfortunate thing. We've said something harmful before we realize what caused it, what motivated it, appropriately or inappropriately, most often inappropriately. So once we acknowledge that we know that bias is there, we'll count to 10 before we react. We'll take into account those actions in relation to the specific situation so that then we can be more effective in finding strategies that reduce the harm of those implicit biases. And we can extrapolate this into the work of governing. It's important to acknowledge, make ourselves accountable, and once we've done those two things, we can get to those action steps that we all want to get to. Increasing contact with people outside of our own demographics, our own experiences, the fear factor that you mentioned. I don't know if it was Andy or Melissa. That's what often causes that reaction. And we're not taking into account the facts that may counter our unfound fears and our unfair biases. So again, we have a brain, we have bias. We have to acknowledge it in order to act against it. Until we do. And again, this is not about guilt. This is not about blame. This is about humanity. This is going to happen. I gave an example where it happened to me, and I'm sure I've acted out on biases in other ways that are completely inappropriate. But until I can face into them, I can't do anything about changing them. And I can't get into the action steps. And this is where a government can come up with the policies, the practices, the procedures that will account for those biases and counteract the negative impacts of those biases. So I hope that's helpful. And again, I appreciate all of you really going a little deeper and trying to put yourself in the judge's shoes, understand what people might have been thinking and why they reacted the way they did.
Thank you, Rita. Melissa, next slide. And so, Melissa S., one of the things that you just talked about, policy, and that helped me to bring into what we're going to talk about now, really thinking about biases and fully being aware of the fact that they exist at the individual level, but they also exist at the institutional level as well. And at the institutional level is where policy lives and plays. It's like the policy playground in a sense. And there are examples of not only implicit and explicit bias individually, but there are also examples of implicit and explicit bias with institutions. And so what I'm going to do right now is just kind of walk us through the slide that we have here. Then I'll give you just a little bit of time to kind of process it. Not too much, maybe 30 seconds at the most, probably less, to be honest. And then we're going to move to the next slide where I'm going to ask you guys to provide me examples of institutional and individual explicit and implicit bias. And so as it relates to the institutional explicit bias, these are policies which explicitly discriminate against a group. Again, explicit discrimination against a group. An example of that, the U.S. court rules dreadlock ban during hiring process is legal. I'll say it again. The U.S. Supreme Court rules that dreadlock bans during hiring process is legal. That is a direct discrimination towards a specific or particular group. An example of institutional implicit bias, policies that negatively impact one group unintentionally. Again, the key word here is unintentional. An example of this, police departments using stop and frisk style racial profiling. The intention wasn't to stop or disproportionately stop Black and Brown, people in Black and Brown communities disproportionately. That was not the intention of this, but that's actually what ended up happening with this policy. So again, that's an example of both institutional explicit and institutional implicit. And then when you get to the individual level, an example of this, of individual explicit bias, prejudice in action, discrimination. Again, it's overt, it's out there, you see it. A restaurant owner threatens to call ICE on Spanish-speaking customers. Again, very much explicit. You see it right in your face. An example of individual implicit bias. Again, it's the unconscious attitudes and beliefs. And we talked a little bit about the unconscious piece in the past few slides that we talked about. But an example of that, an employer not calling back an applicant with a Black sounding name. Again, not conscious of it. Just happens due to their attitudes or particular beliefs. And so we wanted to be able to provide you guys with just a couple of examples of both institutional and individual implicit and explicit bias. I'll give you about 30 seconds just to kind of read the examples. And then after that 30 seconds, we'll go to the next slide. And I want you guys to take an opportunity to create your own examples as it relates to each one of these categories. All right, Melissa, next slide, please. Now want to provide you just with a little bit of opportunity for you guys to create your own examples of one implicit and explicit institutional policies, and then implicit or explicit individual biases that could potentially, that you could create for yourselves, or not necessarily, I'm sorry, for yourselves, but that you could create as examples. And you're more than welcome to write it down or just unmute yourself and throw it out there. Melissa S.
I've got a couple.
Sure.
One that we talked about last summer that was like, we were kind of like, wow, like, you know, we could really do better, was just in our marketing materials, how, you know, they really were not representative of a great deal of diversity. To say the least. And so I would call that institutional implicit, maybe. I mean, I'm not sure it necessarily negatively impacted, overtly negatively impacted, but we were essentially marketing to one demographic. We were only, you know, our marketing materials were really targeted to one group of people. So that was one that we talked about. I'm not sure it's a perfect example. Another one would be just in housing, and I think that this may be explicit institutional, that in order to qualify for some deed restricted housing, you have to be a U.S. citizen, and so that, you know, that immediately eliminates perhaps you know, a segment of our workforce that have not gained full citizenship or you know, proper documentation. And so, you know, that can be a real hurdle for, and as we learned in our last session, long-term housing is sort of the foundation of stability and economic growth. So those are two examples I thought of.
Thank you, Melissa. Jesse, is your hand up, or were you just?
Yeah. Yep.
Because I know you're enjoying sun, so I don't know if that was you trying to.
Sorry, this is our last virtual meeting. I am enjoying the sun, but I appreciate getting to do this here. One thought on institutional explicit is like in France, where they have the bans against religious headdresses in schools and in other public spaces. That one comes to mind. And then also just more locally, you know, I live right here at a trailhead, and a lot of times I hear like just the explicit, like, go back to Denver, or go back to where you came from. And so that's not even a racial thing. That's just
right.
Us versus them. And I think that we see that a lot up here. Just given, like, you know, I have achieved where I want to be, and this is my community. And even though we're very reliant on our visitors and tourists, like, if they do something, you know, we make it known, like, that is not okay. And so to me, that's just totally, you know, putting up those barriers of us versus them.
I feel you. And Jesse, where would you put that? Would you put that in individual explicit or individual implicit?
I think the explicit in the example I just gave. I mean, it's the whole world could hear that.
No, you are absolutely right, and that is also a great example of an explicit bias. Like, and how do they know that they're not from Denver? You know, how do they know that they're not from Fresco? I'm sorry. Like all of those things, those assumptions that play into our biases, for sure. Anyone else want to throw out an example of either institutional, implicit or explicit, or individual, implicit or explicit? Andy, I see the shoulders. I feel like it's burning in your chest, friend. Go ahead and unmute yourself. Don't let that heat stay there. Let it out.
See, you know.
This is your time to shine, man.
How about institutional explicit when here's both of them.
Gotcha.
When I was in high school, we had two lunchrooms. There was a white and a black lunchroom. It was explicit in the 60s, and the signs came down, but it stayed that way to the 80s, right? I don't know what it is today. I couldn't tell you where they're at, but it was institutional bias completely. I've had other experiences that I would say more that happened to me, as opposed to I know what has happened to anybody else. I'm not really anyone to talk about other people's experiences. Right. So I'll leave that at there. There's your institutional implicit and explicit.
For sure. That's definitely explicit. And Andy, are you sure? Because this is a space for you to share. And I think that your experience
in a public meeting.
I think if you can do it in the right way, but what I am saying is that your experience is powerful. And the more people know your experience, and that's with each and every one of you on this screen as well. Your experiences are powerful. We learn from them, and it's an ability, and it also helps our ability to be able to connect. And so I'm not going to push you to share, but I do want you to know that for sure. And I mean that with everything that is within me. But you gave a great example for sure of institutional explicit. And I will ask for maybe one more example, and if not, that's okay. And if there's not one more example that anyone wants to share, we will connect that to Rita.
Shante, I'll jump in with, no, if this is directly, but the conversation that we're having nationally around monuments, I think is a real manifestation of people, of the shifting sands upon which some of these institutional monuments, these things that they represent, these institutional representations, and how people's perceptions of that's changed. And what has been accepted for a long period of time now, as people are speaking out more in a diverse but in kind of a unified voice, that they're asking for that level of involvement and respect and incorporation into that. So, and you're getting across in different areas, different regions, that institutional pushback. And it's a fascinating study of people in denial to a huge degree about what their heritage is and how implicit they would like that systemic and institutional racism to be, because they're happy with it. So it really becomes kind of a real flashpoint for that dividing line between what people have been willing to are willing to accept and what they've had to live with. So I find that this whole conversation around monuments exactly that, because so much is bundled into that, people living now and facing what they had to deal with for generations and generations and generations. So I think it's a fascinating study in terms of how different communities and our society as a whole is looking at it, and either trying to defend the whole idea of it and what it means, and then trying to do flank runs to try and maintain that legacy. So I think that's an interesting example.
I think that is too, Daniel. And something that you said that I just wanted to pull out, people being in denial about their true heritage. And I think we can connect that back to the house we live in and the documentary that we had the opportunity to see, and how through that documentary, it's easy to see why people can be confused about their heritage or what their heritage means to this country, which I think feeds into the denial that you just mentioned. But that is extremely fascinating. And it definitely connects directly to institutions trying to understand and grapple with what do they do with these policies and how can those implicit and explicit biases impact those policies. And I don't know, can you all still hear me?
Shantae, I would.
Yeah,
We can hear you, but your face went away.
Okay. What is an institution we choose to celebrate? What we choose to raise up as that's emblematic of our culture and our community and our values. So institutionally, that's an important statement, and will inspire movements. And you have to be aware of that socially, what you're going to trigger.
That awareness is key, and being able to connect that awareness with action is also really important, because you would need to take the proper steps in order to still make sure folks understand that there's a place at a table for them. And how do we move through this piece together? And so, and I apologize, I have absolutely no idea what happened to my camera. And so I think that this is probably what it's going to be until we end. However, I'm glad you can still hear me. Pretend you see my face. And I'm going to kick it over to Jesse, who I can see is unmuted and wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I just want to add kind of one thing along the lines of what Dan was saying. And, I feel like a lot of times community might address the institutional explicit bias, like, oh, there's very clear language here that's biased. Let's change that. And then they assume that will have either the snowball effect on these other biases, or that we can just ignore the rest because we dealt with it in law. And I think that without addressing every single level of this and acknowledging it at every level, then we're still kind of missing, we're missing the journey towards a solution. But you see a lot of times in this kind of, hate to reduce it to a debate, but like, oh, didn't we fix that problem back in the 60s? Like we took, like Andy Held just said, we took the signs down, right? Like in the cafeteria, like, didn't that fix the problem? And then people just choose to still sit in those various, cafeterias in that particular example. So I think it's really important that we, yes, of course, the institutional piece, but then there's all these other layers that if we ignore it, then the problem, that's why we continue to still see this issue.
Jesse, that was a very powerful point. Like being able to understand that if we want to create a holistic solution to a very deep problem, we can't just stop at one level. I will say that as it relates to the institutional explicit and implicit, there's a lot of power that you guys hold within your hands as leaders within your community, leaders within your town. And through that and that deeper examination, that helps you to get to understanding some of these other areas as it relates to the individual explicit and individual implicit. And that explicit piece I wanted to talk about just to go back to something that Andy said a little bit ago. Like he has a very cued in way of how he believes his core, his values of how you treat people, no matter what they look like, no matter where they come from. And I think he made a really good point. Everybody doesn't feel that way. And so you may not be able to change somebody's thoughts and actions and opinions in one setting. But the more that you're able to learn about this in each one of these stages, you begin to set additional stages that help to at least create pathways for people to come along. But you can't do that if you don't understand these pieces. And just like you said, Jesse, you can change the institutional explicit because it's right there in your face. But if you ignore those other things that surround it, then have you really changed the problem? And I really appreciate the way that you just articulated that. That was very powerful. So thank you for that. And on that note, I'm going to kick it over to Rita to move into our next section. And so, Melissa, if you could advance the slide.
And this couldn't be better timed. What you just said, Jesse, really leads us into this next conversation. As we mentioned, in the normalizing space, we need to wrap our minds and our mouths and our thinking around terms that are not easy to use. We also want to make sure that those terms don't invoke fear or blame or guilt in any one of us. So when we use the term racism, it's not a pejorative. It's not an accusation. We need to understand that it's a system that's in place, that's been sustained and maintained over time. We've talked about policy, but whenever we talk about policy, and you as city leaders are going to be the changers and the change agents around policy, but policy by itself doesn't bring about the change. Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964. The Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965. What are we seeing today? The policy was changed, but the practice and the procedure that come behind that policy, that buttress that policy, that activate that policy, they have to happen at the same time. So yes, policy change agents, get it on the books, but then the practice and the procedure behind it, that's what gets at the systemic nature of what has become this term. Racism is a system. It's a system of oppression, and it's based on race, and it's used to advantage white people and disadvantage Black, Indigenous, and people of color. It's about power, and it's also about fear, which has already been mentioned this evening. But that system of racism, again, we've talked about it existing at the individual level, at the institutional level, and at the structural level. So I think about it sort of as these concentric circles. The individual is at the middle, and your heart and mind are where they are because of the way you've been raised, because of the influences in your life. Outside of that individual is the institutional and structural piece that you all as municipal leaders can impact. You might not change that person's heart or mind, but you can change the way it becomes appropriate and acceptable to act out on any given issue. So understanding it as a system around us that's been put in place over time is the only way to begin to dismantle the elements of that system that continue to sustain it. So policy, yes, you can start there. The ordinance, the law, the framework for how you operate. But then you have to back that up with real change in practice and real change in procedures. So the lunchroom signs came down, but people still sat where they sat. Redlining became illegal, but the neighborhood boundary lines were already drawn. Then you have to do something really intentionally proactive to break down the legacy that was created by that structure, by that system that was put in place very intentionally, not by accident, to divide people, privilege some, and disadvantage others. So thinking of it as a system, taking it away from an accusation of us as individuals, but looking at the system and dismantling what's sustaining it is the way that we can bring about the change. So the next slide shows it sort of as an interlocking cog and wheel. And this is where what I was just talking about, those policies, practices, and procedures have to be the sequence in order to break down that system of power and oppression. And this is very different from the individual acts of discrimination or prejudice or bias, although it's built on that. It really comes from that. But it takes it to the next level, to that change level that you're trying to achieve. Once you really look at the policy that might bring about the change, and then how you implement that policy with practices and procedures and guidelines for your city departments, then you can bring about the change. So individuals can hold on to and act upon their prejudices and their biases. But the racism, as we talk about it in this context, is the system that surrounds it. We talk about racism as it's not the shark, it's the water. So if you think about it as pervasive in that way, then you need to begin to think about how to address it in a broader context.
Rita,
So-
can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
I could be premature in raising this, because as we get into policy creation and effects, implementation, and and how that kind of resonates through different communities, we go back to the slide before and I'm glad you brought up the definition of racism, because I think this is intrinsically at the center of this conversation with regards to a policymaker. And we know, or at least I do as a policymaker, what I want as an outcome. I know that I want to advance the cause of people who systemically have been disadvantaged for a long, long time. But when we talk about racism, and in one definition, we talk about racism is defined specifically here as white people systemically disadvantaging or creating, and I know what exactly what the words were, and, you know, Black people, Indigenous people of color. If you flip those two terms, is it still racism? And how do you defend that racism in effect to create effective policy that should appeal to people's enlightened self-interest? So if we're talking about the use of institutional power and authority to create policy practices and procedures that create and perpetuate racial inequities, and we flip that narrative, how do we overcome that to make sure that what we're trying to do resonates not just among people who appreciate what we're trying to do and appreciate that the policy is trying to be effective within a limited scope of use of that power, but how do you prevent that institutional overreach to try and create that equity piece that you're trying to create? So, and again, maybe I'm being premature, but I think of this specifically in terms of that the $4 billion federal program that's supposed to aid farmers primarily in the South, and some of the challenges that they're having in implementing that, trying to get people to understand how to create a community benefit there and how to get people having this conversation so that enlightened self-interest is really how people perceive this.
I really appreciate your digging into that challenge, Daniel, because that is exactly where the challenge is. You're not going to bring everyone around to understanding the context, the history, and the long-term implications of past policies and past practices and past procedures. It is we call it a journey, and we're not using that term lightly. You have to dig into each of the issues. You've mentioned the farming issue, and that's been in the news quite a bit this week. There was a fascinating piece in the Sunday Times about the situation and the challenge in perception and the resistance that those that have not been historically disadvantaged feel unfair treatment. But the only way to get to that point of agreement is through contextual understanding and really diving into the history, understanding the long-term effects of the history. It might be easier around redlining, perhaps, because it's those lines no longer exist, but we see the evidence of them. The farming issue is the same. Those lines may seem unfair now, and those advantages and compensation today may seem unfair to those who aren't getting that compensation. But those who aren't getting it don't carry the legacy that those who have moved through it, who've tried to be resilient, who've tried to succeed, have not had those advantages. Or even, I can't even call them advantages because it was less than that. It was less than that. So it's self-education, it's mutual education, it's sessions like this, digging into the history and the context so that one can get to an appreciation. And again, we're not going to change everyone's mind, but we can provide the contextual history to frame it a little bit more broadly so that those assumptions that people leap to about unfairness can be somewhat dismantled.
And Daniel, I'll ask you if you could do me a favor and talk a little bit more about what you mean by flipping it. That would help me to be able to also add to it, Rita answer.
So, every area is going to be different. And some of these policies in some areas are going to seem very, very aggressive. We're talking about the federal farm bill, for example, that is specifically being implemented in areas where a large part of the call it the electorate, the constituency there is white farmers, and they're pushing back against this perceived advantage now that Black farmers get when all of them are struggling, again, based on your perspective. So when I talk about flipping the narrative in terms of the definition of racism, you just flip those two terms and you put BIPOC where white people are and flip that. And basically you're just saying, well, yes, this by its definition is racism, but because we're trying to reverse a legacy of oppression, we must call it something else now. So, you know what? And so I don't want to get hung up into, you know, nomenclature and you know, trying to really, you know, narrowly define things to create an effect. But this right now, based on the reading that I do around policies that are trying to affect this kind of change, get bogged down exactly, it seems like, in this. And Rita, I appreciate the idea that we have to develop this contextual narrative where people appreciate the difference. And again, that appeals to their enlightened self-interest. I get it. This, to me, is going to be the enduring challenge in terms of effective policy and trying to have a strategy to overcome that, to make sure that people understand the mutual benefit that we all enjoy from recognizing and righting what have been systemic wrongs and you know, over a long period of time. So, but anyway, Shantae, if that answers your question,
it does. It does. Yep, I appreciate that, Daniel. And one of the things that I will add to what Rita talked about as it relates to, you know, trying to provide folks with that context, that is great if you can. But I think one of the things Rita said as well, not everybody's going to catch that. And so I think that there are times where, and I'll just go a couple steps back to those slides where we define the difference between equality and equity. And so when you are hearing folks that, you know, may have the reaction that you're just talking about, they're looking at this from the perspective of everything should be equal across the board. And if everything is started equal in our country, then we could definitely say that for sure. But we recognize that that's just not how it worked, not just for Black folks, but for a whole host of other, you know, people of color and Indigenous people. And so I think trying to shift the conversation from equality to equity and to shift the policy making from equality to equity also allows you the opportunity to be able to provide particular resources and supports for folks that sometimes feel like they are left out, in addition to ensuring that you're applying or providing the appropriate amount of support for those folks who have been left out historically for a very long time. Now, Daniel, I'm gonna keep it 100% real with you. That's not gonna be an easy thing to do. And you're still going to get some folks that want to throw tomatoes at your head for trying to do this. And I just want to be that honest, you know, as far as where we are, because most folks are not patient enough and don't have the time to really be able to sit down and try to understand the context. However, if we're still pushing for equity, then you are able to try to bring along the folks necessary and that you can. And hopefully some of those other folks will come along as well. Once we get closer to the end of this, we'll talk more about operationalizing. And that will try to provide some racial equity tools to help to kind of think through some of the things that you just said, and to also start to categorize where particular folks may be in their understanding of policy making and change. And that will come a little bit later. So I'm going to ask you to hold on to this piece. So once we get to that part, that will be able to connect to some of the things that you just said. But I will leave you with this before I kick it back to Rita to keep going. It's really trying to help shift the mindset from people thinking about this from pure equality to, again, moving towards equity. And when you do that, you get into a whole host of different things that we call intersectionality that's often left out. That's very important when you're thinking about equity as well. And intersectionality gets into some of the things that you just mentioned, but in addition to that, you know, somebody's ability, you know, gender, a whole host of different things that you start to really think about as you're really trying to develop and to create and to implement policy that oftentimes are left out of the equation. And I hope that was helpful. And Daniel, if it wasn't, please be honest and tell me if it wasn't.
No, it does. And when you brought that up early on, equality and equity, that really was the piece that really resonated with me, you know, to try and encapsulate that into policy moving forward and support that publicly, it certainly is going to be the enduring challenge, I guess. And again, this is, I hate getting too bogged down in it, but to me, there's a difference between racism, not a difference necessarily because they're two of the same cards in the same deck. But, you know, I think racism being defined as a use of institutional power to create that definition sounds more like oppression, and racism is a different, you know, I mean, racism to me, when I look at, you know, individual and institutional racism and systemic racism over the time, it's something that underpins the creation of policy, but it's the institutional power or the oppression of that. So that's why when I flip those words, it doesn't make sense to me. So, but anyway, that's just me looking at this maybe probably way too narrowly, and it's way beside the point, and probably way outside the scope of our conversation today. But unfortunately, it becomes a trigger word that makes the conversation way more difficult. You got people throwing around words like socialist and racist, and it's different for everybody. And you can use it you can use the word racism to broadly define, you know, institutional excess, but institutional excess exists in a lot of different ways and creates oppression for a lot of people in a lot of different ways. So anyway, I personally struggle with that as a definition. I don't want to denigrate the importance or the symbolism of it, but I think racism is more than that.
And so, no. I appreciate you providing your perspective for sure. And I'll say this: we're talking about racism as it relates to systems of power. There are multiple different systems of power. We're only talking about it from the lens of race in this particular conversation, because what we do is we talk about race equity and leadership within Real. I will also say to you that it is very important to be able to create and understand the definition, even from your perspective, because you are right. There are definitely many other categories of oppression that's not just related to race. So I am not going to ignore that in any way, shape, or form. And when you start to talk about intersectionality, there are multiple different forms of oppression that's out there that may not necessarily be directly connected to race or racism. But here, for the topic of this conversation, we're talking about racism as a system of power and how that system of power disproportionately impacts and disadvantages Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color. However, I want to say it again, however, I fully understand and to an extent agree that there are many different forms of oppression within this world and within systems. And the more that you're able to dive deeper into policy, and getting back to something that Jesse said as well, fully understanding the institutional and implicit and explicit biases, understanding the individual implicit and explicit biases, by doing that, you're then able to also understand that what those other categories are and what you can place in those other categories. But for the topic of our conversation today, we're talking about racism and how it is a system of power, a very impactful system of power, especially in the context of our country here in America. But that's what we're talking about today. However, like I said, you are correct that there are other systems of oppression. And when you start to talk about world history and world views as well, and world systems, I think those things come into play a lot stronger as well. But again, we're talking about the impacts of race on systems, more specifically the impact of race of systems within America. And I hope that was helpful, but I do fully understand where you're coming from. I do.
As do I, Daniel. So I really appreciate your discernment on this particular paradox. It's challenge, and we do also recognize that we need to give you tools to help dismantle this. So that is coming, and that, you know, as Shante indicated, when we get into the organizing and operationalizing, hopefully some of those tools will help structure those difficult conversations. around the issues of oppression and racism. So the next slide we're going to show you really takes us to the heart of the matter as racism manifests itself in our systems, in our education systems, in housing. We saw that 2 weeks ago. In our criminal justice system, the assumptions we make about Black men and crime, our health systems, as have been spotlighted as the disparities of the impacts of COVID has had on Black and Indigenous and other people of color, disparate impacts in numbers of cases, numbers of deaths, numbers of hospitalizations. In the environment, where are the safe places to live, and where does the flooding happen, and is it those areas that were marginalized back during the redlining days, that were marginalized around where does the waste get dumped? Again, all of these issues are impacted by, all of these show the disparity based on race. And the conclusion that we've come to as we have these conversations with city leaders is we lead with race because that's where the data points us. In each of these areas, we can cite statistics that put Black people at a disadvantage against almost any other group, to the point that we can say that from infant mortality to life expectancy, race is the single greatest predictor of one's success in this country. Put everything else aside, education, zip code, you name it. But from infant mortality to life expectancy, race really is the greatest predictor of one's success. And the numbers on the next slide will begin to sort of flesh that out. Well, particularly, this was a case that the Centers for Disease Control came out with a study in 2019 that showed us that maternal mortality among Black women was 3 to 4 times higher than for white women. And this was when controlling for education, income, and zip code, place of residence. So controlling for those 3 factors, women with similar levels of education, women with similar levels of income, and similar housing and accommodations in their lives, despite all of those things being equal, and I'm saying equal in this case because that's the way the study was conducted, Black women were dying, had been dying, and are continuing to die at 3 to 4 times the rate of white women in childbirth. So this begs the question of what's the root cause. If everything else is equal, what else is happening in Black women's lives that are creating these negative outcomes? We look at the data, we need to go deeper, we need to ask those questions before we can arrive at a solution. So in the next slide, we go to broader areas, not just healthcare, not just maternal mortality, but we look into other issues of criminal justice system, the education system, employment, and housing. Black and Native Americans unemployment is twice that than for whites, and that was pre-COVID. Only 65% of Black or Latinx men graduate from high school when 80% of white males do. 6 in 10 prisoners are Black or Latinx, where Blacks and Latinx only account for 30% of the US population, but they represent 60% of the incarcerated population. And over on the right, we talked about housing last time, but we know that income disparities exist such that Blacks and Latinos, Hispanics are spending more than 30% of their income on housing costs. So these are stark facts. It's data that points to the inequity, data that points to the disparities that have accumulated over time. And it's with this kind of data that we can continue to have the conversation about if these are the facts, how do we dismantle the situation as it currently exists to bring people into a level of greater opportunity and equity. And the next slide is the most painful one to me, because when I show it, I have to tell you that this discrepancy in median family wealth is worse today. I think this is also from 2019. Black family median income is yet lower, and I've seen some articles that are indicating that by 2030, the number for the Black family is going to be 0 in relation to white family median income. So that's a really stark number, but these are facts that we can point to. Again, this is why we lead with race, to illustrate where we are right now and what we need to address in order to bring about any kind of significant change. So in our more recent deepening of our knowledge around race and racial equity and disparities, we have introduced yet another term that we want to share with you to wrap your mind around and your thoughts around. And it's based on the writing of Dr. Ibram Kendi. The next slide will offer you a quote from his book on how to be an anti-racist. That's a big concept. I read this book about a year ago, and I had to read it slowly and reread a lot of chapters of it to really understand what Dr. Kendi was trying to communicate. But he does it in a very accessible way by making a clear distinction between not racist and being anti-racist. So this quote here is one that speaks to us and that we invite you to consider as well. The heartbeat of anti-racism is self-reflection. Again, remember that mirror being held up for you so you see things that you didn't know existed in yourself. Recognition, admission, and fundamentally self-critique. A racist, when charged with racism, will say, "I'm not a racist." Again, thinking it's a pejorative and an accusation, no matter what they said or did. I could have said to the young Black man who said I hadn't stopped a Black person to register them to vote that, no, he must have not seen me correctly. But I didn't. So no matter what they said or did, an anti-racist would be willing to confess and recognize what they just said or did was in fact racist. And then, the missing phrase here is, and then do something about it. So this is a concept that, it's a big one. We recognize that, and putting it on the table for you to chew on, to consider what the words actually mean: racist, not racist, anti-racist. And the next slide tries to lay that out to a degree, where we say the opposite of racist isn't just simply not racist. I wouldn't hurt another person. Humanity, I recognize it. We are all humans. But do we want to become active participants in that change process? Do we want to create policies and practices and procedures that produce and sustain racial inequity between groups, or do we want to generate ideas that justify racial equity? Do we want to move in that direction? Again, racism created the policies. Racism generates the inequity. Anti-racism creates new policies that break down those barriers. Anti-racism generates anti-racial ideas to support and justify racial equity. So again, thinking back on the images of sameness versus fairness, equity versus equality, how do we move the dial so that our actions are actually bringing about that change? So I've said a whole lot. I think we have one more juxtaposition slide that helps you really consider what the journey is. And I said this earlier, and I can't say it enough. It's not about blame. It's about recognizing the causes. Blaming doesn't get you anywhere. Blaming only calls someone out as a racist, and it's seen as a pejorative. It's felt as a hurt, when in fact, we want to know what is causing the inequity. So shifting from blame to cause, shifting from intentions, which my mother always told me, the way to hell is paved with good intentions. You can't just get stuck in the intentional space. You have to get into the effect space. How do you bring about the change? What were the actions? What are the impacts of the policies that are historically there, and how do we change them? Getting away from the notion of simple prejudice, which again, we've talked about bias, we've talked about prejudice, it's part of our humanity. How do we get to address the system that has undergirded or perpetuated those prejudices that we might have grown up with? And instead of the complaint or the grievance, how do we get to the solution? And that's where we want to take city leaders. That's where we want to empower city leaders with tools of recognition and then action to get to those solutions that you're longing for. So one more time, just to underscore, the next slide really tries to boil it down to racial equity requires anti-racist policies. So getting to those policies that close the gaps. You want to close the gaps that are creating a situation where race is the greatest predictor of one's success in this country. That can no longer be the case. So closing the gaps is key. Targeting those systems that are perpetuating those gaps and focus on how to improve things for those who have been historically and continue to be worse off. And moving beyond that sense of being the savior and providing services and buttressing and doing a repair for something that has historically been a wrong, but focus on what caused it. Is it fear? Is it the unknown? Is it anxiety, baseless anxiety? Is it an assumption that the judge might be a criminal walking into a high-end store and he needs to be watched because he might be about to steal something? How do you get beyond that sense of assumptions and focus on the root causes and really achieve racially equitable outcomes versus inequitable outcomes? And the next slide gets to the point that Shante raised earlier. We know that while we lead with race, because the data is there to affirm the fact that those disparities exist in all categories, we do know that there's an intersection. And the next slide really shows you that the intersection of many of these isms or assumptions is where we can try to achieve equitable solutions for all. So while race is the primary predictor of success in most areas of an individual's life, racism also overlaps with all of these other issues that we know advantage one group over another. So if we can try to achieve equitable solutions based on race, we're going to benefit individuals who are negatively impacted for these equally disparate, equally inequitable attitudes about who they are, whether it's your gender, whether it's your race, whether it's your class, whether it's your ability or disability. Equitable solutions will benefit everyone at the intersection of where those disparities have existed historically. So I'm going to take a breath. We realize we're at about the 15-minute mark before the end of our time with you. We have a little bit more to cover, but I want to make sure that all of you are having a moment to process this. And the next slide is actually going to give you a bit of a fire hose treatment of something that we did when we launched REAL 6 years ago. Our executive director, Clarence Anthony, hosted what we called a REAL Talk to launch the race equity and leadership initiative at NLC, which is now a department and part of our member and partnership engagement center. But he invited a past president, Matt Zone, another past president, Karen Freeman Wilson from Gary, Indiana, to speak to this initiative that we were launching in 2015. We also invited Tim Wise, who's an author and speaker on anti-racism. And his name is Tim Wise. He's written several books, which we will share with you when we send you our follow-up resources and tools. But Tim kind of nailed it in about 3 minutes, and we're going to run this video by you and then take you through the rest of our presentation.
Tim, you have written a book about this subject from a different perspective. What are your thoughts, opening thoughts about where we are in America right now?
Well, in the 3 minutes, 3 to 5 that we've been given, I'll do my best to answer it. And I know we're going to get deeper into this conversation as we go, so I'll save some of what I want to talk about for that. But I really appreciate the way that you framed the discussion at the outset, because at least on 2 occasions I heard you reference something that we really don't do very much in this country, and that is you referenced systemic racism, and you referred to it in that way. And I think that's important. In fact, it's critical, not just for the National League of Cities effort, but for our conversation as a country. Because too often what we do, and I think we all know this, is we look at racism as that thing that happened in Charleston. That is to say, and when I say that thing that happened, I'm not talking about the generations of institutional racism. I'm talking about the thing that happened this summer. We look at that as racism. We say, well, Dylan Roof walks into a church and massacres 9 people, and the city comes together, and the state comes together, and the country grieves, and that's racism. And then we sort of wash our hands of it because we say, well, thankfully, that doesn't happen every week. That doesn't happen all the time. That's an anomaly. But we have to be prepared to look at racism as something that's far deeper than that, and not about bigotry, not about overt hatred, and not just about that type of random retail violence, because that's retail violence. We got wholesale violence. And by that, I mean, if you're going to understand what happened in Baltimore in the last 6 months, you cannot start with Freddie Gray, and you cannot start even with the police department in Baltimore. You have to start with the fact that that is a community that was wrecked by so-called urban renewal. That was violence. When they come in and they put the interstate through your community and they knock down your business and they knock down your apartments and they make folks huddle into small crowded housing and they essentially lock them in a holding pen. I mean, we talk about housing and education. We talk about neighborhoods as if it's not about racism. We act like folks just ended up where they ended up. But let's be clear, this thing that we in this country call the ghetto, that was created. And it wasn't created by black people, and it wasn't created by poor people. It was created by folks who were usually not black and definitely not poor as a holding pen for the people they didn't want to live amongst them. So we have to be prepared to call that violence. If you don't call zoning laws and redlining violence, even though it does violence, and you don't call it racism, then how are we going to solve that? So I want us to frame this conversation the way that you've done it. And I think that's where we are as a country. We're still stuck in this mode of describing racism as this interpersonal thing rather than understanding it structurally and institutionally. And I think until we get to that place where we can talk about not just that individual cop who does something wrong in the community, which we can see plenty of examples of that, but until we deal with the mentality that says that spatial isolation, segregation, residential isolation, black and brown kids going to schools 12 times more likely to be places of concentrated poverty. That's not an accident. People didn't choose that. And so I think that's where we need to go, is to frame the conversation in a way that reminds us that we're talking about systemic and structural violence. And we can't just talk about the sort of retail level stuff, as important as that is, and as horrific as a hate crime is. To be really honest, at the risk of being hyperbolic, aspects of this country's history have been an intergenerational hate crime against certain people. And that's just the truth. We don't like to use language like that. Sounds un-American, unpatriotic, whatever kind of terminology we use, but that's real. And unless we're prepared to do it that way and have that conversation that way, I'm afraid we'll keep spinning our wheels, coming back, having the same conversations over and over and over again. The reason that low-income black folks were the ones hit hardest in New Orleans was not an accident. And what was stunning to me about it, and I lived there for 10 years, the only people that were shocked by what happened, for the most part, were white folks. Black folks weren't shocked that they got uprooted. They weren't shocked that they got left behind and forgotten. That was the history of that community. Right? Urban renewal did that. Interstate highway construction right through the Treme, the oldest free black neighborhood in this country, did that. And so it was just same thing, different day. A little bit more extreme, and the cameras were on, and they made movies about it. But it was the same stuff that had always been happening. So we have to go back to that systemic understanding, which is something I think the movement historically knew, but most of our leaders have sometimes forgotten.
Wow. So we're going to have a real conversation today, aren't we? I think I'm ready.
So indeed, Clarence was ready, and he led us into this and took the leadership role. That was a lot that Tim laid on us, but we were able to sort of absorb it and continue the conversation from there. We like to say that Clarence is never speechless, but this was a moment when we realized the full implications of what we were undertaking 5 years ago. 6 years ago now, and we've moved that forward. So that was a lot. We have 2 more sections that we want to share with you, but I want to get a sense of. Oops.
And Rita, I am going to just for the sake of time, we're going to cut a couple pieces out, but I want to take a quick second because generally you try to provide time for folks to digest that clip, and there are a couple pieces that Tim talked about that I wanted to pull out. More specifically, where do you start? And so, Daniel, you when we were talking about, the definition of racism as it relates to structure and power brought up some really good parts, really good points. And I think the way that you're able to decipher, what does it mean, or what is it, or is it structural racism or systemic racism at the time, is really talking about and thinking through, where do we start in order to figure out the root causes? And so I want to shift a couple of slides in order for us to start to really talk about organizing and operationalizing. And so, Melissa, I'm going to keep saying, push through. And so next slide, so we can get to a different place. So can you go to the next slide? Next slide, please. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Stop right here for me. So those slides that I just pushed through, but you guys will get these slides and you have the opportunity to look through it and go through those clips as well. And if you want to, reach out to ask questions or to go, if we could set up more time to go through that, we'll be able to do that. We'll leave that up to you. But what we really want to get to is, how can we shift norms toward anti-racism? And how are we thinking about behavior change, and what does that look like? Because if we can start folks to change their behaviors and even start to think about their attitudes, then that's going to really be able to help you guys as you're thinking about, from a personal perspective, the policy and the power that you all hold as leaders within your city. And in order to also be able to try to bridge the gap to bring people along. And a lot of that starts from really trying to think about what are the root causes? Where do we start to think about the impact and the intent of the policy that we're creating? And we really, again, are moving into that space of how are we shifting? And I apologize that we're kind of rushing through some of these pieces, because I know that our time is coming to an end. But again, just wanted to bring this part right here, behavior changes ahead. What does it look like to shift those norms? Melissa, next slide. Next slide, please. In order to be able to do that, in order to really think through policy change and system change, a really key piece is listening and having the opportunity to validate the importance. They are very important first steps. And when you can do that, then you'll be able to start to see and to hear where are those areas that you need to go as it relates to system change and policy change. And the key piece of that listening is, you're not just listening to yourself. You're listening to the people that are most impacted and the most affected. You're bringing them into the conversation in order for them to be able to help you to identify and see maybe some of your biases. And even if it's not recognizing some of your biases, sometimes it's just calling out things that you just didn't know. You weren't aware that this was impacting a particular community. You weren't aware of the intersectionality of the impact of that community, i.e., one of the slides that Rita showed you guys talked about that really important piece of intersectionality. You saw those bubbles. You had a bubble for race, you had a bubble for gender, ability, sexuality, and class. And all of those things can tie together when you label race or layer race over it. But in order for you to even understand each one of those bubbles and how they intersect, you have to first be able to talk to and listen to the folks that are the most disadvantaged and bring them into the conversation and into the aspect that you're thinking about policy change and system change within your communities. Next slide, Melissa. That's a difficult thing to do as well. So I'm not trying to make sure to paint this as a picture that is super easy. And it's a difficult thing to do as well when you're also trying to bring other people along within your city. And so a tool that we really want to provide you all is what we call ACT. How are you able to affirm, counter, and transform? The affirm piece, starting with the heart. Explain why we're all in this together. And if you get a countering perspective or view to that, the next piece is, how do you counter? How do you explain the structural roots and the realities that people are going through? And then, how do you think about taking on race in a different way? And then you want to transform in these conversations that you're having, to reframe from thinking about this from the standpoint of winners and losers, and to reframe that conversation again so that people are starting to think about it with what's the heart and what's the intent and the impact, as you get to the end of trying to work through a solution. And Daniel, I really wanted to bring this slide back up because I really appreciated your conversation And thinking about, as you're talking about, what if you flip that definition? You know, how are you having these conversations? How are you trying to bring folks along? How are you trying to help folks to understand? And I think this model, this tool is a way of being able to do that as you're thinking about your conversations, not even to challenge the individuals that you're talking to about racial equity, but for all of us to even challenge our own thoughts and opinions, because as we talked about before, we all have biases and we all have blind spots and don't fully see all the time, you know, how certain policies or actions can impede or impact the lives of others. Next slide, Melissa. So we'll stop right here for just a second. And I really wanted to say that we talked a lot about normalizing, just trying to create spaces where it's comfortable to have the conversations that we've had today as we're talking about race and racial equity. And I should take a really quick pause and say this. I feel slightly hypocritical because at the beginning of this, I asked all of you to keep your cameras on if you can. And now we're a few slides from my camera being out and I'm the one that's off camera. So I at least wanted to acknowledge that and say, I do feel bad because I wish you could see my face and we could connect. So I apologize. But in addition to that, we've talked a lot about normalizing implicit bias, explicit bias. What does this mean? And I know this is a really crash course of diving into it. But I know you guys are really talking about and wanting to move into the idea of what do you do with this information? How do you process it, digest it in order to make some sort of change and to use particular tools? And so we're going to briefly just talk about organizing and operationalizing those two other boxes in our national practice that come after normalizing. And so right now, the piece about organizing, Melissa, next slide. Is how are you thinking about this from a way of being able to achieve racial equity? How can you set an example? The first piece that we kind of talk about in our Advancing Racial Equity in Your City Municipal Action Guide, which is a tool that you all will get at the end of this session as well. But we really go back to listening. How are you listening to your communities? How are you listening to your residents? How are you taking that and factoring that into the next steps that you need to do? Thinking about also making a public declaration, which you guys have done here today. You being a part of this training is a public declaration of your commitment to achieving racial equity and thinking through and being on that path and that journey of racial equity. In addition to that, being dedicated to infrastructure and action. And the organizing piece of what we're talking about is really thinking about the infrastructure that you have within the town of Fresco. And how do you look at that infrastructure and to move into action? And that action is how do you start to think about system and policy changes as it relates to what is the overall vision and mission that you guys want the town of Fresco to be able to embrace in order to start to think through how do you create a comprehensive racial equity plan for your town and what does that mean? Next slide, Melissa. One of those ways of being able to organize, to take what you're learning as it relates to racial equity, and Rita said this a little bit ago, this is just the first step of many. The first of many conversations that you all will most likely be having amongst yourselves and working within your town. But how, again, do you start to organize those conversations? And what does it look like in action into practice? And that's really looking at how do you create a core leadership team within the town of Fresco that's built on helping to build capacity and that's built on really pushing towards racial equity. And then once you're able to kind of think through building that core team, and that core team, we would advise that it is a cross-representation of departments within the town of Fresco and a cross-representation of particular positions within the town of Fresco. But creating that core team then allows you to start to think about how do you create interdepartmental teams so that you can start thinking about your contracting work. What does workforce equity look like? What does community engagement look like so that you're really being able to bring the voices of the community together? And so creating accountability agreements within your city is one way of helping to organize what you understand and what you know as it relates to racial equity in relationship to the town of Fresco. Thinking about your department work plans, Creating performance reviews that also are incorporating and embedding racial equity is also key. Starting to learn and to organize your thoughts around racial equity tools, and then also using those things to start to think about how are you now creating institution-wide work plans that encapsulate all of those pieces that I just mentioned. These are the things that you think through as you're in that phase of organizing your understanding and ability to impact and push for racial equity within the town of Fresco. Next slide, Melissa. Now, organizing around groups isn't always the easiest thing. And so we want to be very honest with you. There are some folks that are going to look at you like we fully support. We consider those to be your advocates. You're going to have some folks that they're going to be your followers. They're going to show up within the city, but they may not be as active in really trying to help you all to think through how you create your comprehensive racial equity plan. And then you're going to have some folks that are your skeptics. They are going to have many questions and throw many different thoughts and ideas at you. And that's okay. We don't want you to run from that or to feel as if that's not important. The skeptics are extremely important to the growth and progression of making sure you're creating that table of bringing folks together. And then you'll have your resistors, your opponents. And so the goal is to be able to try to convert each one of these organizing groups, if possible, to the next phase. And if you can't get them to the next phase, then the goal is to say, then where can we at least move them? You want to keep your advocates as your supporters. You're hopeful that you can possibly convert your followers to advocates or supporters if it's possible. And then you may have your skeptics. And so your skeptics, you want to try to convert them to advocates, to supporters. And the real key in order to be able to do that is to use a tool that I just mentioned that we call ACT, Affirm, Counter, and Transform. And then you have your resistors that you may not ever be able to convert, but the goal is to try to make them less resistant. And so again, all of these things are just really snippets. This is a crash course in what we dive deeper into in our 200 and our 300 series in order to explain these things and help you to really walk them through. But we didn't want to just leave you with normalizing. We wanted to provide you with some other things as you're thinking through what organizing and operationalizing could be. Next slide, Melissa. So again, organizing is really just what it says, getting yourselves organized internally and how you can start to utilize and think about implementing racial equity tools. And that pushes you directly into the operationalizing stage. Once you're organized and you start to create those cross-department teams, understand some of the things that are happening from the community perspective, we are hoping that you're pushing to this operationalizing phase. And now we'll talk a little bit about data and how you can develop that into driving results for strategies. Next slide, Melissa. The key for operationalizing is recognizing that you want to always choose impact over intent. And so you could have the greatest intentions. You could be a great person. You could truly mean to do the best for communities, but that doesn't necessarily always mean that your actions have the impact of your intent. And so we say that when you're thinking about this from a standpoint of what is the overall impact on communities and people and residents, you're coming from a place where you're centered in fairness and justice. And the thing that Rita talked about a little bit ago as well, you're also not coming from a place of guilt, because that should never be the motivation. A lot of the challenges and the problems that we currently face, I believe that I said this in our previous meeting, started long before any of us were ever born, any of us were ever thought of being born, before our parents, and even some of our grandparents were even thought about being born. So we didn't create the world that we live in. And so holding on to that type of a guilt doesn't serve us to move forward. What does serve us is a motivation to create something better. And what we do with the responsibility and the leadership power that you all have, that's the most important thing, not holding guilt over yourself. And then in addition to that, you're starting to think through, is your city really ready to govern from a racial equity perspective? When you're thinking about this from the standpoint of impact versus intent, these are the types of questions that you're going to ask yourself as a city, and to have that mirror, to hold it up to you in an effort to be able to really answer that question. Next slide, Melissa. And so a very, very important racial equity tool that helps you to really think through operationalizing It's something that I think, Daniel, you said earlier as it relates to your desired results. Like, what do you guys want to accomplish? And that should always be the key of a racial equity tool. Thinking about your desired result. From there, you move into an analysis state. And that is taking data, not just data from a raw, unworked with or analyzed perspective. Taking data and really thinking about it from the disaggregated perspective. And so when you take data and you disaggregate it for race, it tells a much different story. And that is one of those tools that Daniel, and I'll keep going back to something that you said because I appreciate it. That's the tool, that data is the key to be able to understand, is something being caused by race or is it caused by another system of oppression? But when you're disaggregating from data, it will give you very clear results of what it actually is. And once you have the opportunity to do that, you then now can create strategies for racial equity. And then from those strategies that you're able to create, you then can implement that plan. And then from the implementation stage, it's extremely important to start thinking about communications and accountability and where does that lead you? But as you can see in the center of this diagram is community engagement. And the reason why we put community engagement is because it is very vital to have that engagement at every single phase of this diagram that you see in order to inform you in every single one of these phases. And it also gets back to being able to center those voices of people that are historically and traditionally left out of government. And what does it mean in order for them to be participants within a governing structure that embodies them? In addition to that, it also really and truly helps from the standpoint of policy. And Melissa, you talked a lot about policy, and Jesse, so did you as well. And ensuring that you have these voices at the table, or it's only going to help you to be able to create more effective and impactful policy that creates solutions and the desired results that all of you, I know for a fact, want to move towards. Melissa, next slide. And the racial equity tool that I just talked to you about, one of the key drivers or the key consequences of that is it really helps you to start thinking about your decision-making, because you'll be able to use that tool in every single phase. So now you're thinking about decision-making in areas that you may not have before, where you're putting streetlights. How do you really view complaint-based systems? Is it equitable? Does it truly gather the voices of all of your residents, no matter what area they live in within your community or in your city? And these are all examples of ways that when you apply a racial equity tool and really pull from that piece of data, you get to start to have different decisions that you'll be able to make as it relates to a lot of these things that we have here and so many other aspects that impact local government. Melissa, next slide, please. And so we're going to push past these two examples, but the key of these two examples are really thinking about it from a standpoint of what does it look like when you have non-targeted strategies and you're not even thinking about it from a standpoint of race versus having targeted strategies and you are thinking about it from a perspective of what is racial equity. And again, the data is the key because the data tells the true story. It allows you to take the emotion out of it. It allows you to take additional perspectives out of it. But when you can disaggregate data, when you can disaggregate data for race, it shows you where the true disparities are and allows you the opportunity to create more impactful strategies that help you to eliminate those disparities. And you would not be able to see that if you were only looking at data from a very simple blanket perspective. So again, disaggregated data is extremely important. Melissa, next slide. Next slide, Melissa. So I know I said a lot really, really fast because we have already taken up close to 15 extra minutes of your time. What I wanted to do is to be able to provide just a little bit of reflection. And I know it felt like we whipped through the organizing piece and the operationalizing piece super, super fast. And generally, like we said in the beginning, we spend most of our one-on-one series really talking about normalizing. But we did not want to leave you with just the snapshot of what tools can you start to use or start to think through in an effort to really start to push forward in your journey of racial equity. So you're moving from just the normalizing phase to getting directly into action, directly into policy making, to policy analysis making, and how you're also having the opportunity to center to center community members at the center and the heart of all the things that you do. And so truly apologize for the fact that we ran out of time, but I do want to leave a little bit of space for reflections. And that's anything that's on your heart, any questions that are on your mind, anything that you want to just kind of maybe tap deeper into. In addition to that, I do want to leave you all with the fact that we will be providing follow-up information that not only has a slide deck, but a whole host of resources that could also really help you as you're thinking through your next phases as a town. And so with that being said, I will take a breath. And I will open it up to any reflections over the past 2 days that you want to share.
I would just like to say thank you to Rita and Shantae and Melissa and your teams. You know, this is really hopefully the start of a conversation, an ongoing discussion and review of policies, and really just looking in the mirror at how we can break down the barriers that exist unintentionally within our community. And so I think this was hugely beneficial. I appreciate your time working with us to get here. I know it wasn't easy. And so thank you very much.
Let me jump in too. Thanks to reiterate what Melissa just said. Thank you so much. It's such a deeply important conversation and challenging on so many levels. And to kind of bring that to bear on policy making, you know, going back to the equity equality piece and really trying to understand, you know, the difference between, you know, trying to provide equality and going the extra distance to create equitable policies that create that unlevel playing field that are justifiable because your desired outcome is such that it requires it. And, you know, unless we're ready to kind of identify some thresholds of diversity and go beyond just kind of the more, you know, banal assumptions of desire, you know, to basically say, yeah, here are these, we're really going to create the mechanisms by which we go into areas and attract a really diverse population, starting with workforce. And I think it starts with housing. It starts with creating a space, kind of taking things as simple as job fairs, but doing them somewhere else. It's going to areas in the Front Range in the city where we shop for our employees in a different area and we bring them up here and provide them. This came out of a conversation earlier with a council person. You know, we have hotel rooms and we can facilitate finding employment outside of our boundaries to push our boundaries. And if we're not willing to kind of create, Shantae, to steal a word from you, intersecting strategies to get to that desired outcome, this has been a fascinating conversation and illuminating, but ultimately won't deliver that strength of diversified community that we all desire. Over.
I'll jump in on top of Dan there. Thanks, Dan. Thank you, everyone. This has been illuminating. I have to say, you know, to where we're a small town, right? And, you know, we might not be a very diverse town, but we do cater to the world and we cater to everybody, all colors and creeds and whatnot coming in here. And we serve them, you know, and that's kind of our position. You know, we did have this direction started from us going with our incredible painting in front of Town Hall of Black Lives Matter. And, you know, I welcome the community engagement. We had plenty of it at that point, and we've had plenty of negative, you know, feedback from all of that. This included was in today's paper, right? And unabashed, I welcome that community engagement, and I'm happy to talk anyone off the ledge that way. The big thing, how can we affect this? I think, as Dan was saying, we're really going into it as with housing, right? Because we are going to decide our direction coming up here, which is going to directly affect our working class, which we need to in order to sustain. And we know COVID hasn't necessarily allowed that as much, and it's really about the haves and have-nots. And so as we are catering to the have-nots, especially with our housing objectives, then I think some of this information is going to probably help guide the direction that is coming from. And Dan, I agree that we should let's try to do more outreach out of Denver. I'm not looking for any particular people. I'm looking for people because we're about 40 short at this point. But with that, thanks. And hopefully we can continue the conversation.
I think well said. All. I don't need to reiterate the thanks. I think that's definitely clear. But what for me, I just add in that this has been an exceptional way to do it. I think where we have to start, which is to get to know each other, and I've learned a lot about my fellow council members that I didn't know going into this, and I think that will help me be better in kind of taking that step and making being out there, being vulnerable, but also listening and appreciating people from where they're coming from. So I think this has been a successful beginning for sure. So I appreciate that. Jeff, I think I see you hop in.
Yeah, I just wanted to report that, as you know, Loli is unfortunately leaving us before too long, and Loli has been the project lead on this initiative. So I just wanted to let you know that we've already had some conversations about what we're going to do about that, and how we're going to continue to move the needle and push the ball forward. And I think it was really interesting that Shante suggested an equity leadership team, because that's what we've been talking about here. So we're going to have some staff follow up tomorrow and further conversations about how we continue moving this dialogue forward and accomplishing the mission that I think you guys have set out for us. So just as an update.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you all. So sorry, Mr. Mayor, didn't mean to cut you off.
I was just throwing it back to you. That's all.
Okay, thank you. Again, many thanks to each and every one of you for leaning in and being amazing owners of your learning environment. That is key whenever we do this. And we truly appreciate all of your thoughts, all of your questions, the abilities and for you all to even challenge, like all of that is extremely healthy and productive conversations that will lead you guys down the path that you've already started. So I want to encourage you all to keep going, keep digging, keep questioning, keep asking, but more importantly, keep doing this together. In addition to that, I know that we went through that organizing and operationalizing phase really quickly. But if you guys need any additional support, please don't hesitate to let us know. The energy that you all have, the way that you've been able to connect and engage with each other, I'm so excited for the town of Frisco. And we want to be as helpful as we possibly can. Like I said, we will make sure that we provide follow-up information to all of you. So you'll have some of the tools that we just mentioned in the operationalizing and organizing piece, some of the magazines or I would say guides that we've created to really thinking about racial equity, and just keep going, guys. We truly appreciate this time. Truly appreciate, again, like I said, the way that you continue to lean in throughout this whole entire process. So thank you so much for your leadership of your town, Mr. Mayor. Truly appreciate you kicking us off as well and helping to bring this here. And Lowly, if it wasn't for you, I don't think that we would be here. So appreciate all of the things that you've done to help us to get to this point. Like I said before, if you all need us, please don't hesitate to let us know. I want to give a special thanks to Rita. I know it's a little late here on our end, but thank you so much for being here and your energy. And Melissa, thank you so much for all that you do. Melissa J, thank you so much for all that you're doing behind the scenes. But with that being said, we again truly appreciate your time. And if there's anything that we can do to be of assistance, please don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you.
Thank you all. It's been a real pleasure.
Great. Thank you all. Appreciate it so much. Great few hours of training. Thanks council and staff for being a part of it. And let's take a quick break. Be back at 6:30. Sound good? Perfect.
in case anyone's wondering, that's a photo of the job fair we have going on right now out at Outer Range.
Looks well attended.
It's an out of the box, innovative way to try to find employees for the town of Frisco as well as our local businesses. And we've heard some businesses in other communities are very envious of this effort, and I'm hoping that we're successful, but we'll see.
Yeah, I think it'll lead to good things.
Fingers crossed.
All right. Just take longer for Andrew to get back and. Oh, he's it.
Sorry, I was here. I just forgot to turn the camera on.
That's all right. I know how it goes. Looks like Melissa's right behind you, I think. All right, I think we're excuse me, ready to move on to work session agenda item number 2, and that's the Peninsula Recreation Area Village Center building and a preliminary review. And looking forward to this, and I will turn it over to Jeff.
Yeah, this is going to be interesting to see how they follow the last presentation, but I think you'll enjoy this one as well. So I'm going to pass it over to Diane to kick this off.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, Council. Great to see everyone this evening. You are exactly right. That is a tough act to follow for sure. I actually will be turning this over to Katie Barton. Katie, as you know, is our general manager for the Frisco Adventure Park, has been working very hard on this project. And then we'll also introduce the team when it is time to do so. Tonight, really, what we want you to do is to give us feedback. That is the purpose of this work session tonight. Please review the plans, give us your feedback. Are we headed in the right direction? Are there things that you would like to change? So everything at this stage of the game, it is very preliminary, and really throughout the process tonight, as well as at the end, we welcome your feedback. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Katie Barton.
Thanks, Diane. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Council, for having us tonight. I think I have a PowerPoint here that I think I can pull up and share my screen. So we'll get started on that. Kind of go through these here. So as we kind of go through this tonight, we're going to talk about how we got here, our project goals, the site layout, building design, and then at the end, we'll ask her some feedback regarding where we are headed. So how did we get here? As many of you probably recall, in 2010, we opened the Adventure Park, more specifically, the Tubing Hill. That year, we did roughly 21,000 tubers. Fast forward to present day, we're averaging about 75,000 tubers per season. So we have seen some substantial growth in that time. In 2019, there was a building that was proposed. We went down the road of getting a building in, and as you know, council brought up some very legitimate concerns and kind of put the brakes on that project, had the foresight to take a step back and kind of created this comprehensive vision and project implementation plan. This plan gave us an overview. It was completed and then adopted in October of last year. And then again in 2021, there was an approved budget for this village center building that we're going to talk about in detail tonight. So with the plan that was created, the concept of a recreational village was kind of the basis of the plan. Within that recreational village, we had a base camp, a place where everyone could come. It served as the center of the PRA and all of the amenities. Within the base camp is the new building, the village center building. And as outlined in the plan, it was the highest priority for the plan.
here. So the goals for this project, it meets our critical operational needs, which are office space and administration space, storage for the Tubing Hill, and all the other operations currently happening here at the PRA, along with a multi-purpose flex room, classroom space. You will notice tonight in the building we are proposing that it is not the originally planned 20,000 square foot building. So why not a 20,000 square foot building? Well, why the plan had this larger building laid out, the plan did not lay out additional amenities to increase visitor participation, nor do we think our growth will grow from 21,000 to 70,000 as we have seen in the past. It alleviates pressure on the current day lodge. The day lodge as a whole right now serves really well for the tubing operation. If it's just the tubing guest, that's the ticketing, the bathrooms, the food and beverage, the seating area. However, the day lodge does not really do a great job of housing all of the support that each of those amenities needs, not only the Tubing Hill, but the PRA as a whole. Cleans up the site, as you can see from this slide. We've got some containers on site. These are not the only two. There are additional containers housing most of the operational needs for the Tubing Hill: signage, fencing, tubes, things of that sort. We also feel like a smaller building fits into the character of the PRA. The Day Lodge sits at about 4,000 square feet. The Nordic Center roughly about 1,500 square feet, and a smaller, more reduced, not only the building scale, but architecturally fits into what a village center we feel is at the PRA. It's cost effective and energy effective. I think we all look for those things when building, and then allows for future expansion as needed. So kind of as we go from here, I'm going to be passing this off to Bob McDonald. He's the senior principal and CEO of OLC, who we've been working with on this project. And then Megan Tesson, who I believe you are all very familiar with, principal with Norris Design. I'm going to pass this off to her first, as she's going to kind of cover site plan. And then again, as I stated, we will take feedback, questions at the end. So Megan, you are ready. I can just let me know when we want to move on to slides.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, council members. I'm happy to be here today. As Katie very well summarized, this has been a need for a long time. And attempting to find the best fit at the PRA is something that it's really important to us as community members, because it's such a special place. So our goals really were to find the best fit for today, with room for growth and respect towards the budget. And when I say that, I'm saying that with open feedback. A lot of the building and as well as the site plan you're about to see was really given direction that we had about how things should be done. And that does change, and it has changed. So we'd like to hear your feedback today. So please keep that in mind, that this is an initial presentation with the anticipation of feedback as to what you might want to see different. So with that said, we have been analyzing this site from a number of different angles, and we've explored many iterations. What we're showing you today, we think, is the best fit with the direction we've been given currently, and we'd like to discuss that further with you. So think of this less as a presentation and more of a discussion. We are designing this building to fit our needs today, primarily the need for office space, the room for growth for tomorrow, which could look at possibly looking at moving the day lodge operations as well as looking at summer camp operations. So there's some dualities in the uses. And then, of course, the respect to budget, which really falls into the exact location of the building. So with that said, there's a few different relationships that we've studied in depth. The relationship to the streetscape and the approach as you come down Recreation Way. This is really powerful. I don't know if you guys have thought about this, because a lot of it we've come down this road so many times into the PRA since it was built in 2010, I think it was. And the hard part is the heart of the village is after you get there. You kind of are confused until you get there. So we're hoping that this alignment and this building and some of what we can do can help signal people to realize that you are at the village center, hence the name of the village center building. So that's the approach. We also have a traffic consultant on our team in terms of how we can best create traffic calming for pedestrians as well as good circulation and traffic patterns for vehicles. So you can see in this layout that we actually did align the entrance to the building exactly across the intersection from the existing intersection to the, what I call either the baseball field or disc golf or sleigh ride parking lots, depending on the time of year. And right now, there is an entrance approximately in this location. We want to make sure that we are cognitive and will be further hashed out with the fire department, but they will need access to the building in some way. We also want to be cognitive of pedestrian connections and how we can help notify vehicles as they're coming down that hill of possible pedestrian connections. We'd like to think about some kind of gateway at this intersection in the immediate future and possibly, oh, I don't know if you can see my mouse, sorry, and possibly highlighting the intersection closer to the new driveway location in a future iteration. Another thing that we really looked at a lot was the relationship between the existing buildings, the tubing hill, and also the amazing views available at the PRA. We have those two existing buildings out there and they're very well loved. We want this building to fit in terms of mass and scale and be comparable to the Day Lodge and the Nordic Center. We also wanted to make sure we sited it to take advantage of views of the 10 Mile Range in particular, but also looking at the Gore Range and the other surrounding peaks. And we wanted it to have a physical relationship to the tubing hill and a presence as you enter it. You can see the relocated existing yurt, which for everyone that's kind of looking at this building now, the back part of the building is where the yurt is, if you're visualizing this in your head. So the yurt is moving approximately 25 feet in this site plan. So that's something to look at as we're discussing this. Another thing I really wanted to touch at, which I hinted at, is kind of the respect towards budget. And as we're talking about a respect towards budget in this project, some of the underground utilities, things people will never see, have a huge impact on budget. There's an existing water line, there's an existing high voltage electrical line, and then there's an existing major drainage area, which they're all labeled on the plan here. But if you look at the iteration between the master plan and this, the building has shifted slightly further to the west and to the south due to those utilities. With respect to budget, we want to make sure that what we're doing now makes sense, can be built on in the future, but that we're not necessarily creating excessive disturbance of existing utilities unless we really need to. So that's really important. There's also, when I said the water line, it's really a snowmaking line. It's a huge line, which Addison could tell you more about if he was here. Well, he might be, but I'm talking right now. So that's a little bit of the underground utilities. And then in terms of a relationship to the Day Lodge and functionality of this building and how we can envision it operating not only today, not only on the day-to-day, but also for flexibility for special events or events that are currently hosted. We host a lot of events out of the PRA. So making sure we're creating a space and a relationship between the Day Lodge and the new village center that would allow for tent setup, first aid, good circulation between the buildings, and essentially that heart, that village center that we're looking for with this building. So if you look at this, we haven't defined it too much, but we're looking at creating an area that will be flexible, that will allow for not only current uses, but possible future uses, including, a major, maybe a shift in the future of having tubing and ticketing out of this building, as well as office space and the flex space that I mentioned, not only for programs like Day Fun Club. I don't know why I was forgetting that one. I should know that very well. My kids go to it every day. But also other daily leasable spaces. So that's kind of my high level and probably a little bit too long synopsis on the site plan. And I will turn it over to Bob to get into some of the details on the building, but please kind of take that with a grain of salt and remember that this is a discussion. So thank you for your time.
All right, great job, Megan. Thank you. Yeah, I'm Bob McDonald with the OLC. I'm the architect on the project. And I thought, I mentioned a few things here on the site plan, just function wise and how it affects the building and where we are. Initially we did investigate both a one-story building and this two-story building, and we really felt like the two-story building was a more appropriate scale for this site. It'd be a little bit more visible from the roadway. Also would allow better views over across the peninsula and to the mountains beyond. And I think it fits in really well scale-wise with the existing day lodge on the site. You'll notice that we show a drop-off there on the east side of the building. And once we get into the floor plans, you'll see that it's really a multi-function space. It's not only for safely dropping off and picking up your kids from the fun club, but also serves as the access for staff to the storage space, and then also provides the fire access to the building in case of emergencies. And we've also positioned it in a way that we could expand it in the future, should there be a desire to do that, mainly out to the south and west a bit. And you'll see in the floor plans as well how we can accomplish that, utilizing the same entry feature in this building, being the same entry feature beyond. And then we've also positioned that existing yurt so that it would function in terms of flow of patrons going from the day lodge, going into the yurt for the safety video, exiting, picking up a tube, and heading out to the tubing hill, and then performing the reverse circulation on the site. So we put quite a bit of thought into this. It doesn't mean that it's 100% correct right now. We'll be continuing to tweak and massage as needed as we get into the schematic design phase. But I think right now we're fairly comfortable that this is a good approach on this site. So with that, Katie, can you advance to the next slide? Yeah, so this is the first floor plan. And I'll start kind of in that upper left-hand corner where you can see the word enter and the arrow there. So coming into a vestibule, and we wanted to provide a sort of generous lobby. I think the comment was that, this is a public building. It needs to have a presence. It needs to represent Frisco and the town of Frisco. So having some sort of sense of arrival, maybe some two-story space there to give you a sense of, a little bit of wow factor. And then also a place just to congregate and wait for someone to pick you up at the end of the day or things like that. Also access from this lobby directly are those two classrooms or multi-purpose rooms. They'll really serve the community in a lot of different ways. They would house the fun club, but then they would also be able to be divided up into two separate classrooms or conference rooms, to host various meetings or, whatever rental purposes, family reunions, that kind of thing. And then we also position those on the kind of south facing side of the building so that you'd have those great views of the tubing hill and the outside amenities. Access from those classrooms to the exterior as well. Those classrooms would be serviced also by a couple of offices. You'll see one in the kind of the corner on the left-hand side, as well as one more centrally located. Those would be the offices for the fun club staff. And then also have ample storage, as well as a small kitchen for preparing snacks and drinks and stuff for the kids while they're in the fun club. And also could be used for various community functions or whatever function for the multi-purpose rooms itself. Going back into the lobby, then we've got a couple of we call them dry changing areas, and these are just spaces where if you show up and you've been outside, maybe playing in the snow, and your clothes are wet, and you've got a dry pair, you can hop in there and change your clothes really quickly before you go into the classroom or whatnot. That was important to the team. We've got ample men's and women's restrooms on this level as well. You can see they'll support the entire facility. And then on the right-hand side, we've got the support space, which is the storage, mechanical, electrical type items. So the storage, it's just over 1,100 square feet, and that's intended to mainly store the tubes for the tubing hill after hours. And so each day, those tubes would be taken from that storage room out onto the snow and into that location where they would be picked up by the patrons. At the end of the day, staff can take it back into the storage room and secure them at night. Also have room to maintain those tubes, and take care of that amenity as well. And you can see the double doors that open up onto the lower right-hand corner. Those would open right onto that drop-off circle, so easy to access, load and unload things. Also, you'll notice there's a door into the multi-purpose classrooms off of that kind of the lower right-hand corner of that room. And that's where we would anticipate kids that were dropped off at the drop-off to get into the directly into the fun club space safely. Okay, so with that, maybe Katie will move upstairs. And you can see, again, that upper left-hand corner where the main entry was, we've got an open staircase that takes you upstairs to this upper level second floor. And you'd come up and arrive onto an upper level, balcony, if you will, with views down into the lobby below, and also access to that elevator. So this would be a fully accessible building. And the main functions up here on the second floor are the administrative offices. So we've got 4 offices currently, and then a common copy work area in between the offices, as well as 4 separate cubicles for staff. And then the final piece up here is the kind of a more multi-purpose or break room, if you will. And this is just a place for staff to congregate either during their work shift while they're on a break or eating lunch and that kind of thing, away from the public. But then also could potentially be a rental type use in the future. We would entertain some windows on the exterior of that because you'd have a great view out over the Nordic Center and the lake beyond. And then we've also got a small locker room and a changing function up here as well, so that mainly for staff to use to change in and out of their work clothes during their shift. So in a nutshell, that's the building itself. We're right at about 7,540 square feet. So call it 7,500 square feet for this facility. And the next slide, Katie, we can show you just some very conceptual sort of massing diagrams that will give you an idea of, the flair and feel of the project as we see it now. So again, playing off of those, the roof forms of the Day Lodge and the Nordic Center, the pitched roofs, but maybe adding a little bit more of a modern twist to it, some more clean looks and but exposed timber and things like that. We have yet to study materials and things like that, but we'll get there. This gives you an idea of some of the fenestration. This particular view angle is if you were on the plaza and maybe at the Day Lodge looking across, so you could see the main entry there and some high glass that really will light that lobby space very nicely. And then some windows and such into those classrooms, multi-purpose classrooms, as you go around the building. And then Katie, we've got another view on the next slide that's kind of from the opposite corner of the building. So you can kind of see that circular drop off in the front of this image, in front of the building. And then those doors that go into the tube storage, as well as some of the exterior features of this kind of east facing, and the view that you would see as you're kind of coming down the hill along Recreation Way. Okay. So with that, I believe that's all we had about the building design itself. And we'd like to certainly hear your feedback. We can go back and look at some of those images if you have specific questions. I'll just kind of turn it over to the group.
Great, thank you guys. I appreciate that. I don't know if there's a particular slide or who wants to kick it off if there's questions or comments. Scroll through or just jump in because I got to bounce around.
I can hop in.
You can't see everybody.
Can you go back to the the site plan? Perfect, thanks. So I was just thinking through like how one drives in, and you guys have heard this from me before. I think there's, the parking is not only a lot, but it's in weird places. And so I'm wondering, like, as you come down Recreation Way, how can we drive more people into the kind of underutilized lot by the disc golf course and the baseball fields and the sleigh rides, just to start like loading that up more and earlier in the day, to free up some of the space down below where it currently exists. But then I'm wondering also, kind of about the drop off, right? Like, it wasn't until the very last slide on the building where I realized the drop off is dropping right off to the double doors to the storage area. And to me, that doesn't make any sense at all. Because then you gotta, like, for somebody that actually needs to drop off, you're gonna have equipment, you're gonna have kids, you're gonna have, whatever is driving you to go to the front door, you wanna be at the front door. And so to me, that drop off is either in the wrong spot or it just doesn't make sense to do it at the storage area. And then you turn around and you go back out again. And the only way that you can really, the way that traffic currently flows there is to the left, right? You turn left, and we all know that turning left sucks. And so I'm wondering if there's not an opportunity to enhance that intersection a little bit with a roundabout or some other way to make turning left a lot easier, because nobody turns right and goes back up to the hospital to exit the adventure park, right? They all go out the other way. So right out of the gate, that's kind of screaming at me. And then related to the building, some of the aspects are really cool. The fenestration, the windows, the views, the solar gain. But I'm wondering if you had an eye towards rooftop solar and the roof angles of the building, and how that, I'm having a hard time really kind of orienting myself to that. So I'm just asking from a design perspective, A, whether you consider it a solar array on top of this building, B, is there enough roof space to do that? And C, are we orienting that in the appropriate manner as well? So those are just some of my initial thoughts.
Okay, great. Well, yeah, really good comments there. I appreciate that. I think the challenge with, and we'll start off with just the site access and, coming down the hill. I think that, people are going to first be attracted to that destination, where they want to be. So if you want to go to the Tubing Hill and the Day Lodge, I think you're going to drive to, the closest parking spot. And so I think trying to, direct Tubing Hill traffic to that other parking lot is going to be tough. I mean, and maybe Megan can possibly address some of the ways that you could, potentially encourage people to take that route. But I think that the majority of people using the tubing hill are going to park, off the front of the day lodge over there. And pedestrian safety is going to be just really important. And I realize maybe we need to study that drop off a little bit more and maybe shift it to the south a little bit more and get it closer to that entry to the classrooms. I think that's a really great point you brought up. But currently, if you're coming down that hill and wanting to go on the right-hand side to drop your kids off, to drop them off safely, they get out on the north side of the street, right? And then they're supposed to walk up to that pedestrian kind of where we're showing the pedestrian gateway, right? Cross the street there, and then walk all the way back to the entry to the building. And I think what's going to happen is the parents they're either going to try to flip a U-turn and drop their kids off on the south side of the street so that they're that much closer to the front door, which that's not exactly safe. Or they're going to just drive around, turn left into the day lodge parking lot and drop them off there, and then have them walk across. So we wanted to provide something that was just safer. And I think once parents learn that that's a great place to drop off my kid, and we make it a little more convenient, then that will become a great, safe way to get your kids in and out of the fun club. And then finally, I think your final point was about the solar array on the roofs. And that's a really good point too. When we were looking at the single story building, that had this tremendous roof on it, and it would have been fantastic for a big old solar array. And now that we've gone with this 2-story concept, it's more efficient. It's more compact and energy efficient in that way. But you're right. There's not as much square footage on the roof for a solar array. What we can do is potentially look at a reorientation of that gable. The main gable right now, we've got it going north, south. Maybe if we flip that around and took the main going east and west, that would give us a more square footage facing a more southerly direction, so that our solar panels would be more effective. But yeah, we've definitely been keeping solar in mind and sustainability in mind every step of the way, and we'll continue to do that as this design develops.
I would need to not consider solar it being the sunniest place in Frisco out there. I mean, it's like the perfect spot in terms of Frisco.
Yeah.
Everywhere else you get super shading. I guess just one more point on the parking, kind of again to the overflow lot, let's call it. And I agree with you that people's tendency is to drive to where they want to be, but in doing that, we get this overcrowding and this intense use of the existing parking. And then if people can't park there, the only way kind of out of this whole, again, the only way out of the whole adventure park is sort of to go back out to the highway and around. And I'm not saying that don't drive up the hill, but that's kind of where all the traffic goes. And so I think then we get this perception that we need more parking, we need more parking, we need more parking, because it's all so intense down there at that end. So I think we really need to try and look at how we drive behavior and get people to spread out and utilize what's already there, because I am not in favor of adding a bunch more parking down there because of that behavior. Like, we have parking, we can use it. So I'll leave it at that.
No, Jesse, those are great points. Thank you. The solar, the parking, the drop off. I think one thing that I sort of touched on is the drop off also does operate for a fire department purpose as well. So there is that. We do need, in some respect, a drop off to the building, and I do appreciate the conversation of where the door should be. We went back and forth. This is a building that wants to have 4 front doors, they're all important aspects. And I also think your point of the parking is very well taken. And I would like to suggest, right now we're studying this building, but I would like to, take this moment to have council consider to look at not only signage, but kind of gateway or possibly art features that could draw attention to the fact that you are entering the PRA up. I'm gesturing a lot, it doesn't work well at Zoom, but up at that intersection where we created a 4-way intersection. That needs to become more important and more noticeable. It is not right now, and I totally agree with you on that. I hope we can make that an important intersection in the future.
If I could jump in, because that is a perfect segue, Megan, thank you, to my main comment, and great feedback from Jesse there. And, I love this design. I love that we're talking about this because most of us have been involved in this conversation for many years, and it's starting to kind of come together. I especially love that you have space for art. The landscape design looks like a really great starting point. You've got a lot of potential areas. The one thing that, and to what you were just talking about, that I'd love us to just, there's no answer tonight, but moving forward, really think about is how do we tie it all together? And while it may look beautiful in one spot, how does it collectively function? How do we feel like, okay, we're in this place now? And Megan, I know that you get exactly what I'm talking about, and it's cohesive, it's not messy. One of the huge drivers of the master plan to begin with was to sort of unclutter the PRA and make sure that we weren't just like throwing things over here and then over there. And, there was some rhyme and reason, and the master plan kind of sought to tie it all together. And so we're seeing that. And so looking really specifically at this plaza, how do we almost create that focal point and then radiate from there? And I don't know, because I'm not a designer, but I'd love to see that in future designs. And Megan is a member of Make Frisco, by the way, and I know that she gets all of this, and I just wonder if that space for art is more of a focal piece, maybe not. I can't say one way or the other. I mean, something that's really signifies that, okay, you're here, this is the center, and from here, everything sort of, radiates outward. On the parking, the only other comment that I had was, we've had a lot of talk about transit and how do we get transit working and functioning in this area. And so just keeping that in mind, and the overall sort of multimodal transportation throughout this whole area, not just for vehicles, but for bikes and for hopefully future transit. So.
Melissa, I'm so glad you said that. We do, as I kind of mentioned, we have a traffic engineer on our team, and they're focused on that exactly. We know we need to study this not in a traditional traffic vehicular pattern way, but in a way that's really looking at how do bikes come into our community? How are people getting here? How are pedestrians coming in? And if they do get to take public transit, the way the current drop-off is, how are they orienting towards the site? So it's sort of weird because you're really tasked with this building, but we know it's so much more. So this is kind of a first pass, and we appreciate that.
And also, one thing I just did a national park trip down in Utah, and the electric bikes, and I expect stuff like that to really. So how would something like that work in this area right around the building and functioning? So, anyways, great work. I love it.
So Andy held trying to jump in, and then Andrew.
Yeah, that's great. Good points. Appreciate it all. We need more parking. No, the big thing is, as you come in there, I can tell you from experience, we park going towards the west on the left side to drop off people, because we're not spinning a U-turn and coming back on that pedestrian gateway. Everybody pulls up facing that way on the pedestrian gateway on the wrong side of the road. It's just it's a function of of what it is, right? So not that it should be that, maybe we should address that a little bit as a safe crossway for pedestrians and kids and whatnot. Yeah, on the turnoff area, I totally agree. I think maybe as it is, you could pitch that to the more of the north side of the building there, and you wouldn't be at the back storage area. But the storage area is something, I think, do we really need 1,100 square feet of conditioned space for storage of tubes? We could easily almost have a separate building that would be unheated and whatnot that could look the same, right? We could do something like that where this whole building isn't, in the belly of this building isn't everything that is meant to be outside and trashed, basically. Obviously they need a place to work. They can need a place to repair stuff and all, but the actual storage of the tubes, I don't see that being in that building necessarily, personally. I agree. We've talked about the gateway coming in. We definitely need to, identify. I don't know that it needs art everywhere. I would like art everywhere, but that's very expensive, right? And then getting into the expense of the building, hopefully there's no precedent, but we got a much lesser building at the marina because we weren't willing to spend the money on the building. And so this is a really nice, impressive building. I like it. I don't know what the price tag is on it at this point, and if we're willing to go there, right? So budget should be a concern or an issue. Totally agree with the solar and all. But here's one for you that I'm going to throw on everybody. Anytime we look at this stuff from now to eternity, that I am here from now to eternity, which might be a term or two, I want input from our appointed board of experts, which is the Planning Commission, and I want real input from them. I not only one kind of direction from staff. I want to hear from them, and maybe that means that we have to do work sessions for any sort of project of this size with the Planning Commission, so we don't end up going down the road and before they even get to look at it, it's a baked project and nobody's going to change anything about it, right? Especially as we are entering green building, right? Because as we're going to build sustainably, and we've got a new sustainable building code that we're going to try to meet, we now need to look at our buildings differently, right? They have to be commissioned from the ground up. We're not just we shouldn't, just apply what we used to do and then let's make it green, right? That's not green building, actually. These are whole buildings and living buildings, and they have to be built integrated with all of the systems commissioned together. Solar and everything that will be part of it. And I think Planning Commission, given the opportunity, could really expound on the needs there. We've got a couple architects, we've got real estate agents and all on our Planning Commission. So, I would like it to be policy that before we see this kind of stuff or during or something that it would be with Planning Commission input. I don't know if anybody agrees with me. You'll just hear me say it every single time otherwise. That's how that's going to go. Let's see. I do want to say just about the PRA, we had input from the baseball coach the last time we were on, and he was talking about the master plan didn't include the baseball field that's there. I will fight, kick, and scream to keep that baseball field as long as we can, forever. It's a great amenity. We just watched a high school baseball game there yesterday, and it was awesome. So that should be part of the whole plan. I don't know why we would remove an amenity like that. That was that. Let me see. I think that was most of what I wanted to cover. I appreciate it. Thanks. You know, we do need to complete the vision here and give our visiting public, you know, the finished amenity that it should be. I think that was about it. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. I do agree with you. I think town projects of this scope should have maybe some joint sessions with Planning Commission. So we'll work towards that. Andrew?
Yes. Hey, I like that we're all playing our role. And Andy, you talked about Planning Commission, Jesse, parking, Melissa, art, and I'm going to go off on function. So, and if I mean, I don't know. In the world of a discussion, I'd prefer if we all saw each other. And I'm not going to reference specifics, but I will. I hate. I'll give you the fair warning. I got a list. So hopefully, consultants, you are prepared with a sharp pencil, because generally, it's a start. But I look at this as function, and then form. And when we start with it's only satisfying our most pressing needs, then that means the building is insufficient on the day it opens. So what I'm hearing is this is the what are we calling it? The Village Center building, but as currently designed and explained, I'm not hearing what it's the center of, because it's not the Tubing Hill check-in area. So that's not where everybody goes to go tubing. That's still the day lodge. So I'm not going to belabor any point, but I think that if it is the center, the Village Center building, then the function should be the center of the village. So what less pressing needs are we not satisfying? We are not, this is not the center village check-in area for tubing. I don't fully understand how it's going to function in the summertime, but I think those are two very distinct needs and should be looked at differently. What's its function in the winter and what's its function in the summer? A very detail-y thing in the building design, there is a small overhang 2 stories above the front door. And then there's a very large overhang of a window just to the left of the front door. And in our environment, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. If we're going to have a phase 2, there's already conversation about that this building is not sufficient and we have to expand it before we've even opened it. Where's that going to go? And I think that it should be, if that's going to be a necessity, it should be at least shown as a shaded area so that we know that it's going to be an expansion, not a renovation, because doing renovations is ridiculous. The big storage space, again, this I think it was Andy who made the point. We're storing tubes in the winter, and to put them into what's going to end up being probably $300 to $350 a square foot space when all they need is a shed, then why do that? You know, we can all, and whether we put them in a separate space or make a shed, incorporate a shed into the design of this building so that now it's $50 a square foot space to build it instead of conditioned space. Again, under current function, where it's not where anybody goes to check in for the Tubing Hill, to have 6 stalls in the men's room and 6 stalls in the ladies' room for what effectively is an administrative building doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. If it is truly the public building, then maybe that is the proper ratio. But for the existing conversational use, those bathrooms seem huge. I also noticed that this is not a big space. And to have doorless bathrooms in a quiet, small building seems to lead to a potential embarrassment for somebody. So I don't see the need for doorless bathrooms here. Huge lobby, there's a reception desk, but at the time, I don't hear us saying we're using that space. Again, that lobby with a reception desk isn't being used for that purpose, other than to tell people who pull into the drop-off circle to go tubing. Then we have to tell them when they walk into this building that they're in the wrong place and they need to go over to the day lodge to check in, even though this is where the drop-off circle is. So there are, going upstairs, we have 2 balconies on private offices. So I'm not sure, I mean, I love our employees, but to put everybody in a break room in the back corner and then give 2 people offices with private balconies doesn't seem great. And from my understanding, the function of the offices is not for people to live in all day. They're out and about type functions there. It's not town hall. So people aren't going to be living there. We also have a 200 square foot office with a private balcony, and that's a damn big office. So again, if it's necessary, great, but they seem awfully big for the functions they're providing. There is no public access out of the building to the tubing hill. You have the classrooms on the first floor, and the classroom, if you're checking in, let's just say we make this building functional as the check-in facility, you would think somebody would come in the front door, check in, walk out the back door to the tubing hill. Heated storage, the copy room, again, you're putting the copy room on the best view. Why not put a couple of cubicles, give the people who are working in the cubicles a windowed office, even if there's a couple of them there, and put the copy room in interior space. If there's a reason to have the cubicles where they are, the one on the right, the far right, you have to walk through this person's cubicle to get to the locker room. I don't know why we would want to do that. And I also question the lockers on the second floor in the back of the building. I don't fully understand the function of the employees, but if they get dirty during the day and then they have to traipse all the way through the building to get to the back corner where the locker room is and have their break in a room, you know, that, again, maintenance disaster. There's a waiting area on the first, is there a waiting area? You have a waiting area on the second floor, but no reception desk. And there's no waiting area on the first floor, but there is a reception desk. And I'm not sure where the security systems are. So where people can, where the public can and can't go, how do they get, how does somebody walking in to meet somebody in the upstairs offices get access to that space? Again, going back to Jesse's point, and I'm sorry for belaboring, but hopefully, and I can provide this list if that's an easier way. Again, the drop-off area doesn't make sense to be in the back of the building where you can't actually access the building. But I did have a thought through this conversation that if we have that drop-off area in the winter, or I'm sorry, in the summer, close it off in the winter, because you really have to look at that, to me, as a field of snow. And to put a road in the middle of the field of snow is, I think, functionally and visually odd. And also, if we have a fire issue, we can, fire lane issue, some way or another, we can work through that. But I think we can look at that drop-off circle as a winter-summer differentiation. Maybe it works in the summer, but it doesn't, I think, work in the winter. You have to walk through the cubicle. Balcony should be off the break room. I did have show where you propose solar panels to go, just so as we pursue the design, we know that it's a part of the thought process. Which parts of the building? No thoughts of food and beverage still at the peninsula. Allows for expansion. I'm always curious. We took the building and master plan super broad brush from large to small. What are we missing? Functionally, what is this building not doing now that if we had more space, we might be able to do? I don't like the multiple roof lines, because one is the expensive construction and the other is those are all going to turn into ice dams and leak spots, and that's where the issues are. Again, to the drop-off circle, functionally, now all of a sudden we've got a drop-off circle, and at the end of the day, all the workers need to trudge across the cul-de-sac of the drop-off circle to put the tubes in the storage area. Seems like a mess of logistics to me. I am totally up for more conversations about this. Well, welcome to me geeking out on this process, but I love it. So I think it's a good start. I think functionally we need to look hard at, if this is the center building, let's put all of the public facility here, and then we have a banquet hall and whatever else we want to use the day lodge for. But let's really not build something that is either obsolete, I don't think it would be dysfunctional, but I don't think it would be as efficient as we can make it on day one. So I think we need to look harder at that. And that's it for the moment.
Thanks,
I
Andrew.
wasn't on mute. Wait, I wasn't on mute, was I?
Just missed that middle part. Other thoughts, Rick, Dan? I can jump in too. I think I don't disagree with pretty much everything that's been said to this point. It seems to me like a big struggle is around the storage, and I know the storage is really important. And we're to Melissa's point, we're trying to clean it up and make this kind of the marquee area that it is. And I don't know, Katie, I switched so I could see Katie's expression when I suggest this, but maybe we're trying too hard to store the tubes in the wrong spot, and maybe we build that. I don't know if Andrew said it, the shed or the pole barn structure, but why can't we have it at the top of the tubing hill? And at the end of the day, the attendants send the tubes back up on the magic carpet in the first round of guests in the morning, right up Sans tube, and then we've opened up all of this space for functional use for everything we want, and we could keep the building the same size and have 1,000 square feet of entry hall or flex space or classroom or day camp space that's now, kind of solves a few of our other problems and maybe opens up the Day Lodge for existing conversations that we had in the past. And I think that was really where I kind of came down to the biggest kind of sticking point to this whole conversation we've had that I've felt is that storage of the tubes and how much it is important. I know they do get trashed, as Andy said, but they're an asset nonetheless that we need to have available and functional every day of the winter. So that's what I would kind of add at this point, and not disagreeing with all the other comments. Other questions, thoughts? Andy Held.
Jump in with the drop-off area. Could that be an essentially in a U? It's a in and out at Recreation Way, right? You come in, you drop off, you drive straight out. You don't have to go in, turn around, go back out, that kind of thing. Cheers. I everything Andy was saying, I'm with you.
Yeah, it could. Thank you. And thank you, Andy. That was actually really awesome feedback. So this is what our team of consultants is hoping for with this meeting, is to get the feedback from the mayor and the council members. So thanks for being open and doing so.
All I have to say is, look, Dan, there's 3 potential ice rinks on there. Lucky you.
I looked at the storage area and was wondering where they're going to park the Zamboni. But yeah, looking at it, I agree with Andrew. Thank you for that in-depth analysis of utilization, because you look at it with a keener eye than I would have. I kind of looked at it and intuitively kind of thought it's just more than we need and more than we talked about in terms of its initial plan for utilization. Hunter, interesting idea on the tubes. I'd have to, organizationally and, in terms of asset preservation and access, I'd have to reconcile that with the staff and the program out there, but it's certainly, those are the kind of ideas that you want to hear to kind of create that efficiency. But yeah, and Andy Held agreed. That was one of the things that I had on my list early on was, make sure the folks at the Planning Commission are taking a look at this and hopefully offering up the same kind of insight that Andrew Aronson did in terms of, again, drilling down into the functionality. That's just a level of insight I don't have on these kind of commercial buildings, but it makes total sense once you kind of hear it laid out. So agree with the, whatever you call that's kind of coming in there. I think that ought to loop, if possible, kind of a drive through one direction, kind of drive in, dropping out. But I'll leave that to the intelligentsia at the Planning Commission to kind of work out with the people who are using it. But again, it just seemed like it was a a very big and aspirational shot at this. And certainly, I think based on what I've heard and really just looking at it, seems like trimming it down somehow is not unreasonable. I think it kind of comes back to a number, you know, which really kind of where we worked back from at the marina, which was, you know, if this is $700 a square foot at 7,000 square feet, then great, you know, you got a $4 or $5 million building on your hands. And really, you know, it might be more like, you know, what can we do with 3 million, you know, which is really when this conversation started a couple of years ago. I know it was closer to 2, I believe, but so anyway, yeah, thanks for the comments. I think I'd like to see something smaller, simpler, and economical.
Go for it, Rick.
So again, good insight from the other gang. Thank you for that. I really like the idea of the pull through. I don't understand why it's on the storage side of the building. The way I see this working is kids club participants are getting dropped off at this drive-through, and I don't see how they get to where they need to go. But I like the idea a lot. On the same thing on the drive-through, I see out of towners dropping off their families, and this is an opportunity to put a sign up and steer them to turn right and park in the overflow parking. But if you live in Summit County, we all know you're going to park in the parking lot on the other side of the day lodge, which is cool because I think for functionality wise, that separates our parking situation. And again, functionality. What is the day lodge going to remain? Is it going to be a rental space with a inadequate kitchen, or and then we transition everything over into this other building? I think that makes sense. I think one of the reasons we got here and to have a single building is because we've talked about having 3 different buildings out there, and I like it all in one place. Now, that said, heating that space, I agree with the rest of the gang, doesn't make any sense, but I really like the way it was thought through that it's all in one spot. As far as transportation goes, we have our existing bus stop there. I don't think this is Highway 9, and I think we can get people across Recreation Way safely. And again, we'll just continue working with Summit Stage to get the drop off because they have multiple ways to get in and out of there efficiently. And if we can get a drop off point, I think during the winter, that's going to be a significant amount of the traffic coming in there. And again, we'll get them across Recreation Way safely. So I like the idea. I got to tell you, this is the first time I heard of the Village Center, and I was a little taken back by the title, but it all makes sense. So just functionality and location is where I'm at. And again, I think a lot of the gang had a lot of good ideas, but I think there's some opportunity here as we go forward to steer different user groups to different areas, definitely when it comes to parking. And then other opportunities to incorporate their whole day of tubing in the morning and skiing in the afternoon. Thanks.
Thanks, Rick. Appreciate that. Katie, Megan, Bob, any
Hunter, if I could just add one thing, you know, Dan mentioned kind of the exercise with the building at the marina, which I think was very useful. And I think we have a really good functional building that came out of that exercise. And I think some of the input, honestly, that F3 gave us on how to run a marina was really helpful. And while they are marina experts and not adventure tubing park experts, it might be, I'm just trying to think out of the box, but it might be helpful to like run this idea past them and see what they think and see if they can hone in on some functionality, because we're all basing this kind of off our own experience on how we drive through there and how we visit and what we observe. They're totally they're third party. They're looking at this from a totally different perspective. So I don't know if that's contract creep or what, but I thought that the marina building, turned out really well because of a good, well thought out exercise, and it might be worth some input here too.
And Hunter, let me ask a question. What is going on? I know we have, 300 pounds, million pounds of wonderfully industrious people crammed into a 10-pound box in the bottom of the existing day lodge in terms of offices. But what is the future use of that? Will there still be offices down there? And how many, and this might be a question for Diane, because I don't know, who are we building for? How many employees are we building for? Will we retain some office space? I don't know the division of responsibility out there. Is it functional to keep some office space there? What is the future utilization of the day lodge going to be? And how does that play into the amount of office and size of office space that we provided in the new building? So more to Andrew Aaronson's points, which is that's pretty nice. Those could be the nicest offices in the county to work in, which is great. But what does it look like if it's scaled back?
So to answer your point, Councilmember Fallon, the goal would be to actually move all staff offices out of the basement. Currently down there are 3 staff offices. There are cubicles. There is an area that serves as a call center, and there is a staff break room. Depending the season, how we can hire upwards of 50 staff members, part-time, full-time, for the winter season. So the idea being, out of the basement, we do know, even as part of the master plan, the day lodge would still need to go through some type of a renovation, meaning, it is still, the recommendation was to actually put an elevator into that facility so that the basement still serves as a storage area, but it makes it so that you can move things a lot easier than how they are currently being stored and moved into that area. The kitchen was also in that as a renovation so that it becomes a little bit more of a beefier kitchen, something that can be utilized for more events, for caterers, as such. And then there's also some wasted space in that ticket office being able to be expanded for ticketing, retail. So definitely always knew that the day lodge as well would need to go through a renovation.
So understanding those complementary uses, I think, would be helpful, when it comes to utilization. So, in other words, do you foresee a break room still in the, in the old day lodge? Is that more accessible for, day-to-day people around the hill, something they get into, warm up, come out of? Again, to Andrew's point about in and out of a building. I know if all the offices move to the newer building, some kind of area where people are going to convene and commiserate, that certainly is part of, a good work environment, and however that develops. But enough said. I think there's enough out there now to look forward to a kind of a redraft. So thanks.
Just real quick too, to that point, Dan, this building houses nothing from the Nordic Center, correct? Like, there's still a separate entity out there on their island, and they won't be using these offices or that sort of thing.
Actually, the Nordic and Trails manager would have an office in this building, taking away the balcony, that area, but still, so that, that corner right there is a really good space whereby you can see both what's happening at the adventure park, the Tubing Hill, as well as the Nordic Center. So that was a space that was for the Nordic and Trails manager. And then we currently have a lot of stuff that is stored in the basement for the Nordic operation as well. So we would continue to utilize storage over at this new building, the day lodge, for the Nordic operation also. And for a break room. Currently at the Nordic Center, there is no break room either. So this could serve as their break room as well for staff.
Okay, I think with the potential to build on, if we're looking for smaller at the beginning, we should have our phases almost staged out, that it might be 10 years or something, or whatever it's going to be. But, what are we, as Andy said, what are we missing? for what it's got to be.
One last wrinkle into it, Jesse brought it up, which is ice. And if you're going to have functional ice out there, ice that's leveraged as a real community asset that has a wide spectrum of user groups, then you really got to think about how that's going to impact one or the other of both of those buildings. Because if you're going to have a little skate circle for people just kind of skate around a campfire and kind of hang out and be social and drink a hot chocolate, that's one thing. If the goal is to actually have legitimate ice that that on its own merit, and we'll see what comes from the ice study, but that's a game changer in terms of that, because I don't really see how that's addressed in either of those buildings.
Thanks, everyone. I appreciate that. Diane, Katie, Megan, Bob, any clarification you have? You guys on to pencil number 2, I think, as Andrew put it.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that feedback. And Councilman Aronson, if you would send us that list, I'd really like to have it. I took really detailed notes and would love to respond to each one of your points. Thank you for paying attention and giving us such great feedback. So we are at the beginning stages, so we're going to continue to refine and massage and get this thing where it'll satisfy all the needs. That's our goal.
Do you go by Robert or Bob? I'm sorry.
Bob.
Bob. I'm happy to send it over. I'll probably just do it through Vanessa because I have her email. But
Okay.
Please, I'm not looking for a response. I'm just looking to have these thoughts considered. You don't need to respond.
Okay.
With any, that's not the point. Let's all just think together and come up with the best possible design.
Yeah, agree completely.
Yeah, I agree. This is great feedback. Sorry, Hunter.
No, you're fine, Megan.
Okay, I was like, no one wants to interrupt the mayor.
And I'm sorry, I said Vanessa, I meant Diane.
It's okay.
It'll find its way there. Megan, did you want to wrap up?
Oh, I was just going to say, we do appreciate this feedback. I think one thing in particular that came up kind of across the board that might be good to have a little follow-up direction on is the tube storage in particular. That was kind of not clear, at least in my mind, from this meeting. So maybe that's feedback the council could also get to Diane. And I would like you to consider Andy's suggestion to have a work session so that the communication between planning and council can be really open. And I just, again, wanted to thank you, and also wanted to thank the council for being able to follow such an impressive presentation right before the one we just started talking about, because that was really powerful. And I'm proud of our town for that. So thank you.
Thank you, Megan. I appreciate it. And always your involvement. Diane, do you have what you need?
Yeah, it's very clear. Thank you. No, I'm just kidding. Thank you all for your input. It's been very, very valuable. It's great. I would agree with Megan. I think in terms of having some clarity in terms of how you want to move this process forward with, in response to Councilmember Held's recommendation. I know every time we're in front of you, Councilmember Held, you always mention the Planning Commission. I know we always go, oh yeah, we have to go back to the Planning Commission. So we too want to make this as efficient as possible. If you have recommendations, if there's a way that you would like this process to move differently, please let us know. We're happy to follow that and happy to make sure it's as efficient as possible and we get the right feedback from everyone at the right time.
And Diane, maybe you, Jeff, and I can figure out how to make that happen so it's most productive for everybody's time and get the right people in. Rick?
That's what I was
On that note, you guys, I really fully support having the Planning Commission's input, but I don't need multiple more people weighing in all at the same time in a single meeting. So if they can look at it ahead of time and send a representative or two with their recommendations, I think that's the most efficient use of everyone's time and their input.
Yeah, I was gonna say the same. I really, really value their input. I think that it, especially well, all of them, but we are lucky to have a couple architects, a number of design professionals, a building professional, et cetera. So we've got a pretty stout planning commission. That being said, their purview really is to implement the code. And so I think we do need to be careful about where and how we look for their input. And obviously, you know, I would like them to have more sort of notice of projects like this, so that if members of Planning Commission wanted to weigh in, but I don't want to get into, you know, I think we do need to be careful about what is the purview of the quasi judicial Planning Commission being involved up front on a project that they're going to then review and then enforce the code on. So I think, you know, there's a way to do it, but I totally agree that it, you know, let's keep it non-cumbersome as well.
Yeah, Melissa, that's an excellent point. And I was going to suggest, Mayor, that you and I visit with Thad about how we can accomplish that, but stay within the box of what Melissa's talking about, role and so forth. So we'll have that conversation.
All right. Well, I appreciate everyone. Thanks. That was good discussion, and we'll keep moving forward on that. So thank you all.
Okay, thank you all. Yep, have a good evening. I'll sign off now.
Appreciate it. Have a good night, Bob.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Next up is the consent agenda.
Mr. Mayor, I move the approval of the consent agenda.
Move to approve the consent agenda by Mayor Pro Tem Burley. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Councilmember Aronson. Is there any discussion on the motion? Can you call the question, please?
Certainly. Aronson,
Yes.
Burley,
Yes.
Fallon. Muted. Yeah. Come back to you in a moment. Held,
Yes.
Aiken,
Yes.
Sherburne,
Yes.
Mortensen,
Yes.
Fallon.
I'm back. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next on the agenda is old business, in this agenda item number 1. This will be the second reading of 21-06, an ordinance amending the Code of Ordinances of the Town of Frisco, Colorado by amending Chapter 155 concerning streets, by amending sections 155-3 concerning definitions, 155-4 concerning street design standards, 155-5 concerning street construction standards, and repealing the parking lot standard dimension table set forth therein, all to make appropriate reference to administrative regulations concerning street design and construction. I'll open up the public hearing and turn it over to Jeff.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Mayor. This is the moment in the agenda you've all been waiting for, I'm quite sure. And I don't think there's anything new from your last meeting, but I'll ask Addison to confirm that. And in other words, I think you're ready to take some action on this. You still there, Addison? I see him.
He had been there for a little bit.
Brody probably needs to re-add him as a co-host for him to be. Thank you.
There we go.
There we go. Hello, Mr. Mayor and Council. Thank you very much. There was no recommendation, so I would just like to move forward with getting these changes in the books and keep marching forward.
Addison, appreciate that. Thanks for always keeping us updated and our plans updated. Council, any questions for Addison? Seeing none, I'll open it up for public comment. Anyone wishing to make public comment at this time, please do so. You can raise your hand or unmute and turn your video on. Seeing no public comment, I'll close public comment and back to council discussion and perhaps motion, please.
Mr. Mayor, I move that.
Oh, go ahead.
Thanks, Andrew. Mr. Mayor, I move that we approve agenda item number 1, second reading of ordinance 21-6.
And move to approve by Councilmember Inkin. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Councilmember Aronson. And any further discussion on the motion? Can you call the question, please?
Certainly. Burley,
Yes.
Fallon,
Yes.
Held. Could you repeat yourself, Andy?
Yes.
Thank you. Hinkin,
Yes.
Sherburne,
Yes.
Mortensen,
Yes.
Aronson.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Addison. I appreciate it. All right. Next item is agenda item number 2, and this is our ongoing and general discussion on the COVID-19 response. And I'll turn it over to Jeff.
Yeah, I don't have anything new at this point, other than I suppose, hopefully you all know that the wash bay is open to electeds and staffers. So that's a good thing. All of our buildings are open to the public in terms of public areas. And your next meeting will be in person if you would like to attend in person, both for council as well as the public. We will continue to have the Zoom option available for the public or council or staff if that's appropriate or more comfortable for you. So I do look forward to seeing a lot of you in person in the next couple of weeks. And we'll be doing a test run of all the technology here later this week to make sure everything's up to speed, that we're not going to have any hiccups, we're not going to have any failures with technology. So we're going to do our diligence there.
Fantastic.
Planning Commission will meet June 3rd in the same format too, just so you know.
Great. A whole new set of technologic things to figure out, but at least we'll be moving on and getting back together. Anyone else have any updates? Fantastic. Hopefully maybe we can close these out soon and remove them from the agenda. That's my sincere hope. I think we are at that point. So if there's nothing else, then I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
Mr. Mayor, I move that we adjourn.
All right, in stereo sound on my end.
Yes.
Adjourned. Thank you, everyone. Have a great night. Appreciate the conversation as always.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Hi, good to see you, Deb.